No, I think, all right.
Yeah.
Are you all?
No, they're not connected to the internet.
So it's guess guess at MVWSD. So guess,
All lowercase?
yeah, just guess at sign MVWSD. Do you want to sign?
I'm not gonna worry about it.
MVWSD?
Okay, it's 6:54. I'd like to reconvene this meeting of the Mountain View Wisdom School District Board of Trustees. Did I startle people? I apologize. I'd like to report out in closed session. We approved settlement agreement with regard to student number 60014563 and student number 60014564. This settlement resolves 2 student claims regarding special education placement and services. I would also like to report out on item 3A2 that in closed session, the board unanimously entered into a resolution agreement with the Office for Civil Rights, including training of district administrators and staff on applicable law in exchange for OCR to discontinue its investigation of a complaint against the district.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Getting feedback, we can hear, can we turn that down so we don't have to hear?
Feedback from
Thank you.
people
Sorry.
outside?
No, us.
It's like time
Oh, it's
delay and we're hearing
reverbing.
you in both ears.
Do it.
Sorry.
No worries.
Is that a username?
Okay, and at this time, we'll move on to item 5 of the consent agenda.
I move that we approve the consent agenda as presented.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any
Aye.
opposed? Okay, on a motion moved by trustee Wheeler and seconded by trustee Conley, the consent agenda passes unanimously. And now we will move on to communications and from employee organizations. Are there any member of employee organizations who'd like to address the board? Thank you. Please state your name when you get to the microphone.
Hello, my name is Sean Dector. I'm the MVA president, and MVA looks forward to continuing the positive negotiations between the district and the Teachers Association. MVA hopes through our negotiations we attain and attract new talent to our district, retain our quality educators, raise the achievement in our student body, and that both teams have been working hard on all of these, and I hope that these goals continue. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Dector. Are there any other members from employee organizations that wish to address the board at this time? Okay, we'll move on to district committees. Seeing as there's no representatives from district committees, we'll move on to communications from the superintendent.
Good evening, everyone. Just want to let the public know that next week we will be conducting, as part of our October Safety Month, we will conduct our big shake drill, or the earthquake drill. So we won't release what day it's going to be, but just want to prepare everybody that next week is the week that we do the whole emergency training with the CERT teams from across the city.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Rudolph. And at this time, we'll move on to community comments. This is the time reserved pardon me, for community members to address the board on items that are not on the agenda. The board and administration welcome this opportunity to listen. However, in compliance with the Brown Act, the board is not permitted to take action on non-agenda items. Speakers are requested to complete a speaker card and state their name for the record. And it looks like we have one comment card. So can a Miss Jasmine Telecki please come to the podium?
Thank you for the opportunity.
Please state your name.
I'm Jasmine Telecki.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to address the board. I'm the mom of a 7th grader at Graham Middle School and a 1st grader at Mistral. So if my math is right, we've been in the district for 8 years and we'll be here for another 11. And I'm here tonight with a large group of concerned parents and students, and if you can believe it, there are many more that wish they could have been here, but I let them know on very short notice, so they weren't able to all make it. But we are hoping that the board will take up as an issue revision of the dress code in the district. I had emailed earlier in the week about some of the issues that we have concern about, and I can summarize some of those here tonight. The intention of the dress code is to protect and serve all students. We think there are issues related to sexism and racial bias that result in the current code. I'm certain that these are unintentional and possibly under-recognized until now. Very briefly, this is a partial list. Some of the things and some of the issues that concern us about the current code include the following. It forces focus on girls' bodies. It sexualizes girls and results in a lot of self-sexualization of girls. It punishes girls who are more physically developed than their peers. It punishes girls of different heights, shapes, and sizes. It reinforces the notion that they are distractions. It punishes girls for dressing for warm weather. It humiliates and shames girls at a time in their lives when they're particularly prone to depression, anxiety, eating disorders, low self-esteem, and other issues. I forgot to mention in the intro, I'm a clinical psychologist. I've been practicing in Mountain View for 10 years. And I am particularly keenly and acutely aware of some of the issues that result from something like institutionalized sexism that seems to come out in the kind of code that we have, particularly in the middle schools. Some of the issues are in the elementary schools too. That's a little bit about the impact on girls, or some of the things that I feel, or we as a group feel, impacts our girls. As the mother of boys, I'm equally, if not more concerned about some of the impact on boys with the current code in place. To put it very briefly, we're reinforcing for boys that they are not responsible for their behavior, that their ability to focus rests in the body of another person. So a couple nights ago, my 7th grader, who's a little curious about what my interest is in dress code these days, was asking me, why are you involved? Like, what are you hoping to do? Why is this a problem? And part of what I shared with him, is that a timer for me? Yeah. Oh, can I finish just a little bit?
I would say a little bit.
A little bit.
Please, since you're the only speaker and on behalf of many, please finish.
That whole back 2 rows, we're all here. I told him some of the grown-ups think that he is not able to focus on what he needs to learn at school because he might see a shoulder or a collarbone. He's like, what? So that caught his attention. I think that's what we are unintentionally reinforcing for our boys, among many other issues. There's a lot more to get to that I don't have time for, and I'm really sorry about that. But we are hoping that the board is open to exploring this issue as it relates to student health and welfare. And particularly, my particular interest is in the mental health welfare of all of our students. So perhaps I'll leave it at that. I will mention that Los Altos is also in the process of reviewing their code. I've heard San Jose is doing something very similar, and we have neighbors all in the Bay Area and across the country that are looking at this, and I hope that Mountain View can lead on this issue.
Thank you, Ms. Telecki.
Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any other comment cards at this time, so we'll move on to review and action. Item A, resolution number 02-101019, authorizing the issuance of Mountain View Westman School District 2019 general obligation refunding bonds.
Good evening. So I'm suggesting that the board approve this resolution.
Can't hear you.
Better? Thank you. This resolution would allow us to refund a portion of the bonds that the school district passed on June 5th. Once we refunded the bonds, the savings from refunding it would go directly back to the property owners within the district. So this would allow us to save the taxpayers' money.
Are there any questions from board members on this item?
Yeah, I have a question, and
Sure.
this is a similar question whenever we do this. if we go out for a new bond, is it confusing to voters that we just gave them back some money?
I don't think this would be confusing to them because they wouldn't be, this is not something that would show up on the ballot. This is you giving us the authorization to refinance these bonds. So they would actually just see a savings on their property tax bill. It would also not extend the length of the bond. So the bond period would remain the same. Not like when you refinance your home, the period for the loan would extend, but in this case, the period stays exactly as it is.
Right, but there would be publicity, I imagine, from the school district or the Mountain View Voice, and that's why I'm wondering if it would be a confusing message.
I don't think so, especially because the publicity would all be positive, that they're getting a refund for their taxes and not paying as much. Although I do need to say there's the caveat that we need to watch to make sure that it's still cost effective for us to do this. So the board would be approving, giving us the authorization to refinance the bonds, but when we're watching the market, if it dips below a certain point to where it wouldn't be financially responsible for us to do it, we wouldn't move forward with it.
Is there any reason why we're calling it refunded as opposed to refinanced? To me, I think refunded is like you're giving them money back and that's it. But refinance is just you're taking out different financing, maybe at a better rate.
You know, we actually have an expert here tonight. Would you like to? I have an answer, but I want to make sure that it's correct. So,
good evening, members of the board, Dr. Rudolph. My name is Kristen Villalobos with RBC Capital Markets. We are the bond underwriter, and we have served the district on the past GEO bond issuances as well as certificates of participation. With respect to your question on the terminology of refunded, so it's called general obligation refunding bonds. The purpose is exactly what what Dr. Westover has described and what you're asking. It's strictly to refinance at lower interest rates, all to provide taxpayer savings. And it's really, we look at it as well as you're good stewards of the bond program and looking at opportunities when market interest rates lend themselves to, and it's cost effective for the district. That's the sole purpose of the transaction.
My recollection is that when Dr. Goldman was superintendent of this district that we did this at one point, or maybe at multiple points, and at least the press releases in the Voice just talked about refinancing them at a better rate to save taxpayers money. So it didn't use the word refunding, which to me is a little bit confusing, but I didn't find the concept confusing at all. It's just basically you're refinancing it at a lower rate. So that's my 2 cents.
Are there other questions from board members? Thank you. No? Do I have a motion? Oh, sorry, questions from the audience or comments? Seeing as there are none?
I have
Any
a
additional
motion that the board approve resolution number 02-101019, authorizing the issuance of Mountain View Wisman School District, Santa Clara County, California, 2019 general obligation refunding bonds as presented.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, on a motion moved by trustee Wheeler and seconded by trustee Gutierrez, the motion passes unanimously. We'll move on now to item B, resolution number 03-101019, debt issuance and management policy.
so this second resolution that I'm bringing to you is really just formalizing the process that we already do to make sure that we identify purposes for which debt proceeds may be used, that we identify the types of debt that may be issued, and how we manage it within the district. So it's formalizing policies that we're already currently doing, and this is part of our, in order to refinance the previous bonds, we need to have this in place.
Are there any questions from board members? No? Any members of the audience which wish to speak at this time? Any comments? I have a motion.
I move that the board approve and adopt resolution number 03-101019, debt issuance and management policy as presented, and waive second reading.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, on a motion moved by trustee Blakely and seconded by trustee Conley, The motion passes unanimously. We'll move on now to review and discussion. Item A, results of recent polling for potential parcel tax and/or bond election. Dr. Rudolph.
Good evening. So one of the challenges that you asked was for the district or for staff to go to look at the possibility of looking at either at a parcel tax or a bond as a potential source for generating revenue. We conducted 2 polls, and we now have Gene from Gene Bergman and Associates who will go over the polling results. We also have our polling strategists who are here to answer any additional questions, but I'll turn it over to Gene. Unless, Charles, did you have anything you wanted to put or no? All right.
It wasn't in the agenda.
Yeah.
Laura, would you mind passing the mic? Oh, sorry. Thank you.
You take those.
Oh, the whole thing.
Well, okay, whatever.
Oh, there's this, I didn't realize that.
Is this online so we can look at it without?
All right, thank you. Okay.
It's in the packet.
Oh, no, it's not.
As Dr. Rose said, we did 2 polls for the district, one in June. We did 319 likely 2020 voters, where we focused on a possible parcel tax election. And then just this past September, a second survey, we did 404 interviews with, again, likely 2020 voters, and we focused on possible bond measure. Demographics were all pretty similar. The thing I think that's sort of interesting is now we have over 80% of the people, of the likely voters in the district, are permanent absentee voters. About 3/4 of the people who completed the survey did so online, and only about 1/4 by telephone, which is the way of the world is now with survey research. You have to get people online because people don't answer their phones anymore. Anyway, so chart 1, oops, go back. There we go. Chart 1 was the question we asked in both surveys, an overall job rating for the district. Remarkably similar results. Excellent, good job, 46% in one survey, 45% in the other. The only slight difference in the no opinions at 37% and 32%. People who have kids in the district were much more likely to give a excellent or good rating, which is nice. The parents like you even more, while other people are actually a little more likely to have no opinion. Chart 2. Now this compares the excellent good job ratings over time since the first survey that we did for the district back in 2003. And the green number is the excellent good rating. The gray is the no opinion. You've never had very high negative ratings. But it's been sort of it's almost a sine curve, where it was down 45, 46%. Now we're back to 45, 46% with the no opinion higher than it was in sort of, in the 7, 8 years ago, a few years ago, when the positive was a little bit higher, but the no opinion was a little bit lower. All right, chart 3.
Gene, you have the clickers working now.
Oh, how wonderful. Thank you. The other question that we asked in both surveys was how much need does the district have for more money in general? Great need, some need, little need, or no real need. The green numbers you see here are the changes over time in the great, some need comparisons. It's sort of generally gone slightly down. Early on, 15, 16 years ago, we were up in the 70s, into the 60s, and now the last few years we've been in the mid-50s to 60% range. So there's a little less perception of need. At the same time, of course, the no opinion has gone up. So it's not that the people are seeing that there's no need, it's just that they just don't know.
I do want to also add that the Voice came out with an article after the shoreline, the amendment to the shoreline deal, where the Voice stated that we would get millions of dollars, when in fact we would only receive the additional $100,000 according to the estimates. And so that may have also played a role between the June and September numbers.
People with kids in the schools and women more likely to say that there's a greater some need. Republicans less likely to say that there's greater some need. All right. Now, the next series of charts will be just about the June parcel tax survey. And we start with all the times during the course of the survey. I'll go through these more slowly. People to vote on possible parcel tax measure. And we read them a paragraph similar to what they might see on a ballot. Let's look at the first three numbers. It's the first time it's asked very early on in the survey. 64% said they'd vote yes on a $191 parcel tax. If it was 145, we go to 65%, and 70% at a $98 parcel tax. I have to remember a couple things here. One, it takes 67% to pass anything on a parcel tax, whereas the bonds are 55%. Also, when you get down to that third number, you have to take a little bit of a grain of salt, because there's a certain number of people who will say yes, not because they now are in favor of a parcel tax, but it just sounds better at 98 rather than 191 or 145. So it's probably a little inflated as well. So at best, we're probably still hovering right around the 2/3. During the survey, and we'll get to the specifics that fill in the blank here, we asked people a vote after they had heard positive information, how the money would be used, reasons to support it, and we then voted on the 191. And at this point, you get right up to that 2/3, 68%. And then after they then heard negatives, we went back and asked them again the same question we had asked in the beginning, and we were pretty much the same place on the 191 and the 145, a little bit higher on the $98, up at 73%. There was one other vote which I didn't include on here, just I thought it kind of muddy the waters a little bit, but I think it's worth noting. We asked at the end of the survey if instead of the tax being $191 per parcel, it was 7.5 cents per square foot. How would you vote on that? And the yes was 46%, no was 30%, which is not inconsistent with what we've seen in the past on these kinds of square footage. It's tougher to get people to understand them and to get them passed. Renters were more often yes voters, homeowners a little less, Republicans certainly a lot less on most of these votes. And that was really the main differences on all of those. Chart 5 is, as I said, the first of those series of positive statements are the uses for the parcel tax money, and each one was rated. Each one of these are very important, somewhat, not two, or not at all important. These numbers here are just the very important, just the top score. Led by 3 are particularly important, providing academic support at every elementary school for those students having difficulty with some of the basics like reading, writing, or math, instituting programs to attract and retain the best teachers, and supporting teacher salary increases. They were up in the 40s. But all of these are okay. And there's nothing here where I would say, that nobody wants this. It's just that in the degree and what's really important, this is sort of the litany of them from top to bottom. It's interesting, people who will change their vote, who didn't start out voting yes in the beginning but become yes voters later after they've heard this information, they particularly like the first item, item B, the third item, the salary increases, and item G, adding science specialists and state-of-the-art science curriculum to prepare students for high school. Then the other positive statement, this question, was reasons you might be more likely to support a parcel tax, and these were rated again as being, are you much more likely, somewhat more likely, or does this one have no effect on your opinion one way or the other? Led, as always, by item A, all the money raised by this measure will stay here in our local community and cannot be taken away by the state. I don't know how many hundreds of surveys I've done. That's always number 1, occasionally number 2. And item I, right with it, all children deserve the same high-quality education regardless of which school or in which district they attend school. This measure will help ensure Mountain View students are at least as well prepared as Los Altos students when they all get to the same high school. And then we got the next little group of the lighter green color, none of the money for administrators, supporting high-quality local schools, a wise investment for enhancing our quality of life and property investment for property values. Money is needed for music, art, and other classes, and for offer competitive compensation so the best teachers can continue to live and work in this high cost of living area. Again, the people who changed their votes from no or undecided to yes later on, pretty much consistent with most of these. The one item that stood out for them that isn't generally as effective is the item H, the next to last one. Ever since voters approved the first parcel tax for local school funding in 2004, the Independent Oversight Committee has consistently reported that the district has used the money as promised. Which is sort of a corollary to the money that there's a Independent Oversight Committee. And both of those are always important. That's why we always have them in any tax measure. We then followed this. We wanted to see how aware people are, if at all, of the current parcel tax. 40% were aware of the current $191 parcel tax, which is probably about average, I would say. There are some places where you get a lot less. Sometimes you get a little bit more. Not often do you get a lot more than that, aware of parcel taxes that are paying. Homeowners, Republicans, and people who have kids in the schools are more likely to be aware of it. Oh, dear, pardon me, I forgot to change that. That's the chart. And then we followed that with one other question we asked of everybody, and we asked them, how well do you think the district is spending taxpayer dollars? And we've separated this into three different pies. The one in the center is all the voters. Excellent, good job, 34%, fair, 19%, but 38% no opinion. So either people said he's doing a good job, or they pretty much had no opinion. If they're aware of the parcel tax, 46% good job, 22% no opinion. If they were not aware of the current parcel tax, 26 good job, but 49% no opinion. So there's one of the things it says, actually, there's room for education of people as they about the current parcel tax, to know what a good job you're doing with it. Should you go that route, or actually even if you go to the bond, just to know how well you're doing with all the money that you spend. And then the last question that we have was the reasons to vote against the parcel tax measure. And we asked 5 of these. None of them particularly effective. Items C and D, the most effective. This would be a forever tax, would never expire, even when the funding is no longer needed, at 23%. And we shouldn't approve more taxes until the board proves they can effectively manage the school district, at 19%. But even so, as you see these, the level of reaction they get is so much less than all of the positive items that none of these are particularly worrisome in and of themselves, unless, of course, somebody mounts an active campaign against it, then all bets are off. Okay. And now we have the charts about the September bond survey. Now, before I do this, we split the sample on the September bond survey. And half the 400 people were read a ballot measure that said it's a $30, it's a $30 per $100,000 tax, and would raise $256 million at the time. The other half were not told at first how much the tax was. They were told afterwards. But the first chart is the people who heard right away off the top that this is $30 per 100,000 of assessed value taxation. And we started out with a 57% yes vote for them. And anyone who hadn't said yes was then asked, oh, how about if it was $20? And we go up to 62%. This seems like it's less than the parcel tax, only it's not, because you only need 55% to pass this. And all of these, and then when we asked, again, after just the positive information, we were at 59%. After we added the negative on top of that, we were back at 55 and 60. So we're never below the threshold that we need. Whereas the parcel tax, we only get to the threshold at the last asks, so the last numbers. Generally, more support for the bond in this group among women, people under 60 years of age, and people with kids in the schools. And now this chart.
Can I add something
Sure,
I
absolutely.
just wanted to
Absolutely.
provide a little context. The reason why we asked the bond measure in two different ways, one leading with the tax rate information and one version without, is because current law in California requires the tax rate to be part of the ballot question. And there is legislation that's been approved and is sitting on the governor's desk, and he has until Sunday to sign it, that would change that law so that the tax rate is not among the required elements of the bond ballot question. And so, given the uncertainty about what would be the prevailing law at the time we put this measure on the ballot, we tested it both ways so that we would cover both bases. So I just wanted you to understand that was the reasoning behind the split sample poll.
Wait. Let's see. Chart 11, okay. Now, these are the votes among the people who did not hear the $30 tax at the top. In other words, what it would be like if the governor signs that bill. And we had 61% yes vote to start with. And then when they told the tax, we go up to 68%, and the $20 tax up to 71%. After the positive information, we're still at 64, and the negative, it's negative 62% yes for the negative information and the positive information at the $30 tax rate. So clearly there's an advantage if we don't have to say that actually, which is the way it was for many, many years. You said it was for X number of millions of dollars of bonds, but not what the tax rate would be. And again, yeah, some of the people who've lived here less time, Democrats, renters, people with kids are a little more likely, although not as much difference between the people with kids and without kids as there are on the other votes. Now, among all these people, all 404 read the same problems that could be addressed by the bond measure, and they were asked again to rate these as very important, somewhat, not to, or not at all. And one item stands so far above all the others that it's kind of unusual. It's so popular and so positive. Many of our teachers cannot afford to live in this high cost of living area, 67%. That's an important issue to be addressed, that can be, at least in part, addressed by a bond measure. Then we have, some others, districts expected to grow, and some students may not be able to attend their neighborhood schools. Roofs are a problem, heating, ventilation systems. As student population increase, upgrades are needed to facilities so we can use them to educate students. Energy efficiency, renewable energy, also important. The only one that when you add the very important, the somewhat important, didn't hit 67% is that item J near the bottom. But everything else, even with the item M, which is 29% as being very important, when you add in the somewhat important, they get up to the 2/3. So everything is at least to some extent important. The people who changed, who weren't yes voters at the beginning, became yes voters later on. Their top scores were item K, of course, and that's so far above this number one everywhere. But for them also item F, heating and ventilation systems more than 40 years old, inefficient and need to be replaced. In order to save money, they can be better spent in the classroom. And then chart 13, which again, reasons much more likely to favor the bond measure. This is the same scale, much more likely, somewhat more likely to have no effect on you. A lot of these are the same that showed up well in the parcel tax. All the money raised by this measure will stay here in our local community and cannot be taken by the state. None of the money will go to increase administrators' salaries, payments, and benefits. All children deserve the same high quality of education as Los Altos students when they get to the same high school. The measure requires strict accountability for taxpayers, including an independent citizens oversight committee, mandatory audits to make sure the money is spent properly. And this new one, which really is reflects the previous chart, some of the money we use for housing assistance, so the best teachers can continue to live and work in this high cost of living area. The interesting here, the people who changed, who weren't yes but became yes later on, their number one item was item H, the strict accountability for taxpayers. So it's a real indication that, excuse me, that you need that to win over some of the maybe more fiscally conservative folks. And then our final chart, which is the opposition reasons, if were there to be any. Again, like as in with the parcel tax, nothing is particularly salient. 22% shouldn't approve more taxes until the board proves it can manage effectively. Taxes are already too high. With the economy in a precarious state and a recession likely in the near future, this is not the time to increase taxes. Just general anti-tax stuff, because there isn't really, fortunately, there isn't anything really terrible going on here to somebody to hang that hat on for an opposition campaign, and so these are not particularly effective. And that's the last chart. So a lot of information. What it comes down to, I think, and Charles can speak a little bit more to this, is kind of what I said, alluded to before, that although the parcel tax, if you only needed to go for a parcel tax, if there's no chance of going for a bond at this point, I would say, well, think about a parcel tax at kind of a lower level. But that's not the case. You have needs for both bond and parcel tax. The bond certainly, while nothing's a slam dunk, it certainly has a better chance for success, I think, than the parcel tax would, especially at a level that you want it to be. But I will let Charles talk to that more.
Thank you, Gene. Yeah, I agree. I think we have two potentially viable measures here. I think that the parcel tax is going to would require a really strong campaign to be successful. We don't start at the 2/3 mark. We only get there with making our case, making our argument, and probably also influencing turnout. So I think one of the factors to consider is, are we ready? Do we have people ready to jump in and run that aggressive campaign on the timeline that would be required? I think the bond measure's on firmer footing. We start above the 55% mark, comfortably above the 55% mark if that legislation, Senate Bill 268, is signed by the governor in the next few days. That gives us another few percentage point bump that puts us comfortably in the 60s. So the bond measure, I think, is definitely a glowing green light. The parcel tax, I think, is more, it's possible, but with some caveats. If we think we can really run a strong effort, there's definitely a path to potentially being successful. We've been focusing on the potential election date of the March 2020 primary. We're seeing lots of positive opportunities related to this election, sort of the partisan dynamic, given that California is going to matter for the first time in a long time in the presidential nominating process, is going to inspire higher turnout than we typically get in our primaries, and that's generally a positive phenomenon for bond and parcel tax measures. Also, there are fewer other regional and statewide competing issues on the primary ballot as compared to the general election ballot. So, get more of the voters' attention, less drop off from the top of the ballot to the bottom of the ballot, which again is usually helpful for these measures. So if we do want to take advantage of the March 2020 election, we have a deadline coming up on December 6th. That's the deadline by which we would have to deliver a board-adopted resolution to the County Registrar of Voters Office in order to qualify for that ballot. So if the decision coming out of this meeting is we want to pursue one or the other options, the next steps would be to begin doing some informational outreach in the community. If it is the bond measure, we need to tell the story of the remaining facility needs that exist, how this proposal would relate back to Measure G not too many years ago, so that voters understand the difference and the priorities for this bond measure. And we have a window of time here, but a closing window of time between now and December to get that message out. And then also we would need to take what we've learned from the polling here and work with your legal counsel to build the actual resolution for the bond measure. Again, that would include the project list. The bond measure resolution is a little more intricate and detailed than the parcel tax resolution, so we would need to get going on that right away to build out all that language and bring it back to you for review and approval. So based on that December 6th deadline, we're probably looking at a pre-Thanksgiving action to trigger the election. And then we would move into a campaign. One of the challenges with the March election is that the planning horizon backs right up into the holidays, so either measure going to the ballot in March, I think it would be smart to start working on identifying leadership for a campaign committee, start getting those folks organized, thinking about fundraising, volunteer recruitment, all that stuff that goes into a successful campaign, because when the world wakes back up from the holidays on January 1st, it's going to be a quick sprint to first week in February when absentee ballots go out. So you wouldn't want to start that process in January. You would want to lay the groundwork before the end of the year so that you can really hit the ground running come January. So those in summary are our recommendations, and Jean and I and my colleague Jake Martin, we're all happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Jean. Trustee Conley?
Yes, I do have a question. The state is looking at having an education bond on the ballot in March as well. Do you think that would impact going out for a bond from the district?
Yeah, in a number of the elections in recent years, we've had statewide bond measures, and then lots of local districts have had their bonds on the same ballot. We typically actually find that the highest passage rates are when both measures are on the ballot, and I think it's helpful because, one, there will be a multi-million-dollar statewide campaign promoting that statewide initiative that raises awareness about school facility needs and whatnot. And then you also have, the ability to point out that our local measure, helps us qualify to tap into those state dollars that would otherwise go to other communities. So I think it's generally beneficial.
Thank you.
Trustee Wheeler?
So you mentioned this bill that's on the governor's desk about whether it's going to be a requirement to provide extensive information in a ballot statement about the cost of the bond. If he signs that bill, how will we get information out to our voters about the cost of the bond?
So for years and years, bond ballot questions required you to state the amount of total bonds that the voters are authorizing you to issue. So, 250 million, 500 million, whatever the number is. And the tax rate information was included in a document called the tax rate statement, which is part of the ballot book that's mailed to all voters. In 2017, the legislature passed legislation that changed the rules and said, now you have to include the bond authorization amount, but you also have to include the tax rate, the duration of the bonds, and an estimate of annual proceeds raised. And the addition of those three numbers in these ballot questions, what we found is it has created a lot of confusion, and we see results like you're seeing here where you're losing support. There are more undecided voters because there are these numbers that don't really make sense. And and they didn't give us additional words. We're still limited to 75 words, and we have to pack this additional information in there. So the legislation that's on the governor's desk right now would basically roll back to similar language that we've used in bond measures historically, with the addition of a parenthetical statement that says, see voter guide for tax rate information. So it directs voters where they can find this without us having to pack it into the 75 words. In the informational communication that we would put out from the district and the campaign would put out as well, those are opportunities as well to tell people, and here's the tax rate. So there's other opportunities besides the ballot question to communicate that.
Trustee Blakely?
Speaking of the information that silly term, but the information that the district would put out about the measure, when is the cutoff date? What is December 6th the cutoff date for when the district can spend money other than on purely information? Can you talk a little bit about the timing of the difference between when the district has to stop spending money on it and has to flip over to the campaign?
Sure. Yeah, there's no bright line that says after this date you can no longer spend district dollars. It's just that as you get closer to the campaign, there's more scrutiny on any use of public funds to communicate about this to make sure that it's not, campaigning on the public dime. So typically what we try to do is wrap up the publicly funded communication around the time that the board votes to put it on the ballot. Usually there's one last announcement immediately following the board's action to put the measure on the ballot that explains to voters the action that the board took, what they can expect to see on the ballot, provide some details and context. But then we wrap up that informational communication, and then the campaign becomes the lead voice thereafter. So, looking at this timeline, we're going to have to wrap up communication before the holidays, right? So, if you act in mid to late November to trigger the election, final communication, early December at the latest, and then campaign ramps up after the first of the year.
Thank you.
Sure.
Other questions from trustees? No? Any members of the community like to address the board on this topic? Okay,
I'd
additional
like
comments?
to make a comment, yeah. So my ears perked up when you said 80% of voters in our school district vote by mail, and I think it'd be at least worth saying now and worth saying whenever you make presentations like this is from now on, 100% of voters are going to be getting their ballots by mail, and so nobody knows the impact of that, but I'm hoping that it's going to mean more favorable votes for this, whatever measure we use.
Well, I would just like to comment that just given all the information you presented, from my perspective, I mean, I think it would be valuable use of our time to go after the bond versus the parcel tax, especially given the numbers that we've seen. So we could actually get nearly double the revenue and a higher likelihood of approval. So I'm not
I
sure
agree
if you're
with
looking
you,
for
and
that
I don't
kind of
know
feedback this evening.
when you, Superintendent Rudolph, I don't know when it is you want comments from the board about choices and a vote.
I think now would be good, would be great.
Okay. Well, I agree
not-
with
not that you
President
have-
Wilson that,
you
that I think a bond makes more sense in this climate.
Third.
Yeah, I just think, and I should, before, I'm sorry if you were gonna jump in.
I agree.
I just feel like, given everything we're seeing in some of the other topics on our docket tonight in terms of our enrollment, future growth, city council's meeting next week on their school strategy, we know there's growth, we know we're gonna have to modify, we know we're gonna have to bring up to date some sites, and we don't have to make all those decisions, but we do know that there are gonna be future expenditures. So we might as well look at the most positive outcome that we can get, and I don't think these expenditures are going to be small. So I think the greater success rate that we can have and the more revenue, the better. I'll leave it at that. Do you have anything more to tell me? I see a lot of
We've
heads
heard from
nodding.
4 people. We haven't
Okay.
heard from 5.
You just wanted- Yeah, I guess, are there any other comments from the trustees? We want to thank you for all of your efforts and for the presentation tonight. Thank you, this is very helpful.
And I do want to point out, and I think, you know, both RBC as well as all of our consultants would say that you don't have to issue the bonds immediately after getting it. You can hold on. Just because you approve the bond doesn't mean that it's issued immediately. It can sit as long as we need it, and so we would only act on the bond when we actually needed it, as opposed to saying we're immediately going to start doing something with those funds. And so that's another way to sort of reduce the tax burden until the time that is needed. But I do want to point out one thing that they said, which I think is a positive, and we saw this from another school district, is the fact that you can actually use a bond for teacher housing too.
That was my
And so that polled the highest, and I know Sean would love for us to do that, and that could also reduce the burden by which teachers have to pay in our future teacher housing program.
Thank you for bringing that up. I actually had it on my notes here. I forgot to mention it. Since we now appear to have kind of direction, it's not a vote, is it too early to start letting our community know, just so we could, do we have to take action before we can let people know we need a campaign team, or a campaign team is likely, or is that kind of jumping the timeline a bit?
No, I think if the direction tonight is to, you know, begin developing a bond, part of that is we'll start putting together informational messaging to come out from the district to start telling that story about your facility needs and the fact that you're evaluating a bond. You know, obviously we won't commit to that at this point. That message will come out once you actually take that formal action.
Okay.
And we're currently working on a massive facilities plan. You see Artik, who's our architects over here, that's taking the lead with us. And so that our goal is to have that finished by the November 7th meeting, which would be the meeting before you would actually have to take a vote if you decide to go for a bond.
And we think this $30 figure is the right, like around $250 million bond number is the right number.
Yeah, I think we're seeing
cover it.
strong support at that level.
Okay.
So I have a question. It looks like you only pulled those numbers. Do you have a sense of, if we wanted to go higher, what the favorability of that would be?
So $30 per 100,000 is the legal maximum for a non-unified school district. So you're already at the top.
Okay.
That's good to know.
All right, thank you. I think we have enough information to proceed.
Yes.
Okay. All right, well, thank you so much. We'll move on to item B, compensation study.
Good evening. Okay, I'm going to walk you through our most recent compensation study. For a little context, why complete a compensation study? For our strategic plan, we believe that employees will benefit from competitive compensation packages. And when we created our strategic plan, the idea was that if we hire the best people and we provide them with professional development, that we'll have positive outcomes for our kids. So the approach, when we first started in 2016, we had two different groups that did the study. We had Hanover based in DC and School Services based in California. When they did the studies, they did a cost of living adjustment for the area. So if they compared someone that was down south in San Diego, the cost of living adjustment to make it equal and comparable. The Hanover research group used a list of comparable districts that leadership, meaning the union and the district, agreed upon. So this time through, we used Hanover again.
I want to point out that we agreed upon them a couple years ago, so it's not, we didn't, Sean's here too.
Yes, the original study, not this.
Right,
this
so the first study we did, there was concern, and this would have been 2016, concern about the districts that we use. So we met with both the leadership of CSEA and MVEA and asked which districts should we use as comparables, and then we all agreed upon it. And since that study, we've actually kept the exact same ones. And so, you know, whether or not we need to adjust it is something that we can talk about in our Friday meeting, but at the end of the day, I think both of us would agree these are probably the most comparable districts that are fair to look at.
Good point. So we again had Hanover Research complete the study. We looked at 12 different districts that were comparable to MVWSD. It looked at salaries for certified teachers, administrators, and classified staff, as well as benefits. So overall, what we found for teachers, the minimum and maximum teacher salaries were higher than peer districts. So between the years 2014-15, the school year, and 2018-19, the district increased teacher salaries 27.5%, while peer districts increased it 19.2%. We also added a master's stipend. So initially when we did the study, we did not have master's stipends available, and we now have that. This is looking at the increase in salaries from when we first did this study in 14-15 to now 18-19 and 19-20, based on if the school district had finished out their bargaining for the year. So if we look at how our school district is doing, the percent change was 27.5%. For the minimum salary, and for the maximum, it was 23.8%. So meaning that our lowest paid teachers saw a greater increase in their salary. Looking at the same information graphically. And then also looking at our salary schedule for certified teachers at peer districts. So noticing that the minimum salary for a teacher in our district is $63,980, while the peer average is $60,085. And then at the higher end of our salary scale, we are at $114,705, and the peer average is $107,617. Looking at administrators. So the most recent available salary data for administrators was from the 17-18 school year on the CDE's website. So all of the information for the districts was not posted for administrator salaries. So Hanover, to make sure there is conformity, used 2017-18 data. Not all districts have administrator salaries posted. However, I wanted to note that MVWSD does. Overall, administrators are paid less than comparable districts, and their salary has grown slower in comparison to similar districts. So an elementary school principal in Mountain View earns on average $136,146, where the peer average is $142,631. And that same pattern occurs for our middle school principals. Looking at the percent change in Mountain View, the percent change for elementary school principals was 13.5%, where the peer average was 18%. For middle school principals, it was 14.1% here in Mountain View, and 18.8% for the average for the rest of our peers. Looking at our classified staff, We looked at the average, minimum, and maximum monthly salaries for department secretaries, payroll technicians, custodians, IT technicians, and IAs are higher in MVWSD. Account technicians are lower in MVWSD than our peer districts. Something to note when they did this study is depending on the district, some employees can be paid hourly, some are part-time, full-time, so they accounted for all of those things when they did the study. Then looking at the information across for the different positions. And then looking at our benefits. So Hanover used the 17-18 data since not all peer districts had the information posted again. MVWSD has a slightly lower annual contribution for single participants at $10,288, but a higher than peer average for 2 participants and family. And if we look overall, we can see that for families, the district contributes $26,534, while peers contribute $20,437. So overall, our classified and certified staff are paid competitively in comparison to peer districts. Raises given since the 14-15 school year have made our salaries competitive with our peer districts. However, it's important to note that sometimes we look directly next door to us, to PAUSD and MVLA, and our salaries are less than some of our neighboring districts that are right next to us, although they're not considered comparable districts. The board had directed the district to maintain a reserve level of 17 to 20% to cover emergency costs. Changes to compensation for all positions should be strategic based on the board's direction. So we're seeking your guidance. Of the 13 comparable districts, MVWSD is the second highest for starting teacher salaries and third highest for experienced teachers. Does the Board of Trustees still believe that competitive is the top quartile?
It's fine. I forgot this was in it. You're fine.
So were you looking for questions or do you just want
Feedback.
Sorry, I was writing.
Although
notes.
Sorry.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to sneak up on you guys.
Questions from the board? I was just drafting some notes here for myself. Are there questions?
Yeah.
Trustee Wheeler?
I'm wondering, you made a comment about Mountain View Los Altos High School District and Palo Alto, but traditionally those 9-12 districts and K-12 districts have a higher pay schedule than K-8 districts. So it's kind of jarring to me to hear us compare to those two districts.
I don't think it was so much to compare ourselves to them, it's just more to have the awareness that, because as a teacher in the district, if I look right next door, that's, you know, a few minutes away for me to drive, you know, that's something that teachers are aware of and just acknowledging that that's there. So they're not a comparable district, it's more just to acknowledge that there is a discrepancy that does exist.
So I think it's useful to, when we make presentations like this, to have it be an education point for anyone who's listening that there are different salary schedules for those kinds of districts. I'm more interested in comparing ourselves to K-8 districts and specifically, you know, the old-fashioned term basic aid, K-8 districts, and maybe use, you know, this time as, you know, an educational opportunity.
That's a good point.
I don't know if this is a question or a comment. Are we ready for comments, less on answering the questions? I don't know how much, like if the survey, I'm sorry, is it who did the surveys? Hanover. Sorry, I was thinking Cambridge. I don't know. Hanover has a template that they use, but for me it would be helpful to see like medians, because some of the school districts, like Sunnyvale, is like a lot higher on some of these data points than some of the others, and so to see an average is, I guess that's helpful, but the median would be helpful too, to sort of see where we fit in that. And I'm kind of more interested in some ways where we are now, So the things about the percent change over 4 or 5 years, that's less helpful to me than like, where are we now? That's all.
So we can give them that feedback, but they won't do another compensation study because they have other projects until
Yeah, another year.
next
or two,
year.
whatever.
So
Right.
over the
Right.
summer, we can say these are some things that the board would like to see, but they're now working on a couple other things for the district, and so it's not in the queue until the summertime.
Oh, no, I wouldn't want them to redo it. That was more of a comment for going forward.
Okay, yeah, but we'll definitely give them that feedback.
I guess I have a question / comment as well. Given our discrepancy and distance away from our peer average and principal pay, it looks like this equates to about $6,000 a year per site administrator. Would our budget accommodate bringing us up to peer average? Okay.
It would.
My second question is on this employer contribution to benefits plan. The way I'm reading this, between single plan, two-party plan, and family plan, we are extraordinarily preferentially treating people who are not single. We're 4,000 above average for two-party, and we're 6,000 above average for family plan, and we're way below average for single plan. My assumption, this could be wrong, but we have a predominant amount of teachers who may not be married. So I'm wondering if we've missed a huge opportunity here in having this discrepancy.
We're only $111 different for single from the average.
The other two values though are phenomenally higher. It
Right.
just seems
Okay,
like
I
a
just-
misplacement of priorities, or and this may not pan out when you look at the population
Sure.
and where the benefits are going. It just kind of stood out to me, and I'm maybe not reading the numbers properly.
So Trustee Wilson, just to let you know, we have a large majority of our employees or teachers are families. They are
Okay.
a lot of child rearing family leaves that are coming up. So we are kind of heavy in that area.
Okay.
So that's the majority of our employees. So just want to let you know.
Okay, thank you. That's a piece of information I wasn't sure of, and just seeing these discrepancies, I was like, ooh, we seem to be fairing. But if it's for the benefits, then that's perfectly acceptable. Those were the only two sort of comments that came to my mind. Trustee
Is there gonna
Conley?
I don't have a question, but I was wondering if there was going to be public comment before we comment.
Sure. Are there any members of the public that wish to address the board at this time? Okay, additional comments? Thank you for keeping me in line.
Oh, no. Sometimes it's hard,
Yeah,
when it's a
I was-
discussion item.
I was being honest.
It kind of
Thank
moves
you.
around a little bit. I am interested in, when I think of, I don't want to make assumptions about who our single teachers are,
Right.
but are they some of our younger teachers?
So I just want to point out our contribution is actually higher for single teachers than it is for families. So I actually pay,
Okay.
the cost is more because I have a family compared to someone who is on a two-party plan compared to the singles. The singles actually pay less per month. Their bill, the cost of their plan is less, but what they pay is also less too. And the reason why you're not paying as much is because they don't have anybody else covered within their plan.
Okay.
So while it looks as if, from a pure numbers standpoint, a single person is only getting $10,000, we're paying 90% of their plan compared to a family where you pay 80% of the plan. So, it's a trade-off, but if you have more than two people on your plan, you're going to pay a higher monthly premium
Yeah.
than what a single person is going to pay. And that's true with all of our plans across the board.
Which I think we now have more options for them to select from. Because
So-
I think we went through that exercise a couple of years ago where there was limited choices with some
Kaiser.
benefits not being even, but then
They just
we
had it.
course corrected that.
So the JPA that we are part of now has 9 options compared to 6 options that they can choose from. But what we did a couple years ago is originally any teacher that was hired, and I want to say it's 2012, but I may be dating, I may be off by a year or so. anyone who was hired after 2012 actually was only allowed to enroll in the single plan that the district would sponsor, and then they had to pay for the rest. And what we did was we actually restored benefits for all employees and across the board, so that everyone could benefit from a single two-party and family plan. And in part because the teachers at that time were the only ones who still had that plan, and management as well as the classified staff didn't have the plan. And the example that I used when I presented this was we actually had a janitor who worked for us and had a family plan, and all of their whole salary, working 40 hours a week, went just to cover the cost of the actual insurance plan.
Thank you.
So I have a comment, and as input into this second bullet, does the Board of Trustees still believe that competitive is top quartile? This trustee believes the answer is yes.
Agreed.
Third.
Or
Yeah, I agree as well.
we have a unanimous consensus.
Thank you. I'm sorry for catching you off guard.
It's okay. All right, I think we'll move on to the enrollment update then at this time.
Okay, how do I get out of here?
Thank you, Dr. Westover.
What's going on with that clock?
I know.
Oh my gosh, that's terrifying.
That clock always does that.
Short. How do I get out of here?
Plays the haunted.
Okay. Good evening, trustees. I'm here to give you an update on our current enrollment for the 1920 school year. So as you know, our two guiding principles, which is to place all of our students at their neighborhood schools. And we also pay very close attention to enrollment because, as you know, it drives our staffing. So again, our enrollment determines the number of teachers at each site. And based on our staffing ratios for kindergarten through third grade, it's 24-1. As you know, in fourth and fifth grade, the maximum is 30-1. Sixth, seventh, and eighth grade is contacts. So a teacher can have no more than 180 contacts per day, or 33 students in any one core class period. So, and again, that old adage that children don't come in perfect little groups of 24. So this is a snapshot of the enrollment from September to September. We have a steady number by the end of September when we complete schools settled. We have our children who don't show up kind of out of the enrollment numbers. So I wanted to provide you with an update. I won't go through each and every number, but I wanted to kind of give you an idea of where we are. As you can see, this is 3 years worth. Blue, red, and yellow being 1920, and this is our growth and our movement for our schools. You can see that Graham stays pretty consistent across the board, as does Crittenden, and you can see that we've had a small drop in some of the other schools. And for the first time, we have Vargas, who's staying strong at 293 students right now, with just the K4 classes. And again, you see Bub's enrollment counts per grade level, as well as Castro's and Crittenden's and Graham's and Huff's and Landell's and Mistral's and Monoloma's, Stevenson's, as well as Therakoff's. And of course, this is Vargas right now, staying very strong.
I do want to point out that you should see one additional drop next year when all students who were grandfathered for 1 year return back to their home school.
And I do have that information. Bub will have about 45 students that will transition out. That includes the fifth graders. Castro will have 13 that will transition out. Those are the ones that were grandfathered plus their siblings. Huff will have 41 that will transition out. Landell's will have 43. Monoloma will have 32, and Therakoff will have 32 that will transition out.
Will we be hosting another committee to review petitions at that time, as we did this prior year?
So when you approved the exemptions, they all had sunset clauses, with the exception of the Title IX, the special ed,
And
and,
military, Moffett.
and the military.
To
All
Monoloma only.
all the other ones sunset this year.
But there are often people who will come in and petition based on those
There's
exemptions.
no, unless it
unless
is a
they've already
Title
gotten
IX, special ed, or Moffett, there's no exemption process whatsoever. There's no request.
But if they are those four, there's usually a committee that reviews those applications, or there will not be this time.
All three of those are almost automatic
Okay.
guarantees.
Okay,
And so in order to comply with ed code, those would just continue on.
okay.
So the process for that Tamara's referencing that she was a part of last year was specific because of what we were going through with the transition.
Correct,
Got it.
correct. So
Yeah.
the three committee members who are going to review the applications over the course of a couple days, that we won't need that process anymore.
Okay.
That was just a one-time thing for the changes.
All right, thanks.
And of course, we do welcome if there is a situation with all parents that they can contact us and we can discuss this and explain this to them,
Okay, thank
especially
you.
with our new families that enter our district.
Thank you.
So what I'd like to show you is our district totals for free and reduced lunch counts for the last 3 years. As you can see, and kind of coming on the end coattails of Ms. Austin's report, we are having, it stays pretty steady for the reduced. Free also just has a fluctuation of a few points. We did have about 200 applications that we were able to qualify because they simply don't meet the free and reduced lunch ratio. It's for a family of four, I think it's $36,000 for free, and for a family of four, it's I think $48,000 for reduced. Those are federal guidelines, and as Ms. Austin says, those are state of Mississippi and Louisiana guidelines. They're not what match here. So that's what's really very hard and frustrating, that it doesn't really help some of our students. And then this is a very busy chart, but wanted to give you an overview of the last 3 years per school site of where each school was for free and reduced lunch counts.
The important one to point out is the drastic change at Therakoff. That
Yes.
has dropped from 57% to 23%, which means that Therakoff will be coming off of our Title I list.
And then our unduplicated accounts for the last 2 years. We don't have October 2019 yet. We're waiting on that information, but I can give you an overview of the last 2 years as to where we have been. So
What is the percentage to stay on the Title I list? It's like 30, it's the
So
county
the-
average, right? Or
So the district set the benchmark prior to my arrival, I believe, at 60%.
Said it was 55.
and we amended that to 55.
Okay,
I have a question.
thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So,
I don't think your mic is working.
Oh, I,
but it's green. Well, okay. I'll use my coach device.
No.
Well, it's the same thing. Ms. Geisels, I think by what I understood previously, if a child doesn't qualify for a free and reduced lunch, but they still show up and they ask for lunch, will we say no,
we will feed them.
right?
No, we will not say no.
Right.
We feed them.
And so I'm going to say that in Spanish. Así es que si no han calificado para el programa de comida gratuita, todavía pueden mandar sus niños para que puedan comer todos los días. No se las va a negar la comida.
Sí,
Thank you.
cierto. Sí.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep, thanks.
So any questions for me?
I was
Trustees?
curious.
Nope.
I was curious about the difference in Huff. It really jumped out that the enrollment is much higher than the other elementary schools.
Yes, Huff is a larger school in general. We will envision and expect it to go down. We have discussed, and we have not yet implemented. What we do is we check any resident, any student that we feel is not living in their home neighborhood school, we do check. For example, we had a stack of letters that were returned undeliverable. So my student services team checked it out, and we found out that the apartment complex is under construction. So the complex had moved them and relocated them, and of course, they didn't get their mail. So we have a letter saying that for this year, they're relocated to another area. So Huff is one of our bigger schools. So it was one of the desires of the Enrollment Priorities Task Force to conduct a residence address verification for Huff. We have yet to start that. We've been working very diligently, and now that school has started in looking at other areas, we do really have our eye, and we work with Ms. Smith on the McKinney-Vento students. We just recently discovered a few more. So that's what our focus has been on right now. But yes, there is plans to provide that address verification.
And I believe the discussion was for both Huff and Bub.
Yes.
Those were going to be the two
Yes.
targets. So we
Yes.
didn't stretch resources for all of our
Right.
sites, but for the overprescribed schools.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Geisels.
I had another question. I think we led this off that students don't come in perfect bundles of 24 or 30. But today I was like playing with the numbers and started dividing, and some of these were way off. Like 24 times 3 is 72. And we had like 80 kids or something like that. What are we doing in those schools? Do we have combo classes? Or, I mean, it was like too much to just pay a little bit more.
Right. So what we do during enrollment time, and actually we start weekly, and we have a system in place in my department where we look at it almost daily when it's the high enrollment season. And we do provide combination classes. We work with our site principals diligently. And sometimes it'll change. It'll change over the summer 2 or 3 times. Right. But that's how we try to enroll as tightly as possible in that respect. And we do overload, but to the point where it is an average. We just wait and see how things shuffle out. And then the big push is the beginning of the school year. We have students who don't come, and we wait to hear where they're coming from, and then they disenroll, and then everything kind of settles. So we do have a few combination classes this year at Bub, for example, is one. So Mauna Loma was going to have a combo class in every single grade, but the enrollment turned out where it didn't need to happen, so Mrs. Higgins was quite happy about that. So.
And I think, if I recall correctly, Vargas was one that had
Yes.
some really off numbers.
Yes, they were really heavy in 2nd grade, and then it just kind of filtered out. Now we're a little heavy in 3rd grade. We have a few students over, so it's just the shift.
Okay,
So-
but it's not like 5 or 6 students over.
No.
Okay, good.
Other questions from the board? Okay, are there members of the audience that want to address the board on this item? And additional comments? All right, thank you, Ms. Geisel.
Thank you.
So can I request a bio break for 5 minutes?
Sure, we'll do a 5-minute bio break. Clank.
that's the way I was today. I was so tired I couldn't get back down.
It's just like brutal.
Huh?
But, you know, but then we have a 7 a.m. meeting and then this. It's just like, and then I still have to get a jet lag. And last night was the first night I did not take a melatonin, and I woke up at like 4, and I had to get up at 6 anyway. And I'm just like, couldn't go back to sleep. Maybe it was 4:30. Oh well, I think that means I'll sleep well tonight.
I hope for me. I hope for you.
Devin, if it's not you should just go home. Just go home. Just go home.
All right. Do we have 3? We have 3, right? Yes.
I know, but you can watch if you're feeling sick. You should go home.
Fine.
She's not feeling well now. She just got one. I think she should go home.
But you know, so Devin, I think your comments would be very valuable. Yes. So do we have a paper? I guess we don't. So how do you get Devin?
There's a clear pathway if you need to die.
Maybe we should get the meeting started.
Devin, how do I get out of here and into the other one? Don't touch me.
Okay, we'll go ahead and get started again. I believe Trustee Gutierrez will be right back, and we'll go into our future growth with Dr. Rudolph.
Yep. All right, good evening. So I am here to talk about planning for future growth. We have 2 of our architects, Bill Gold and Gene Young, who are working with us on this project. And to be clear, they started off working on the North Bay Shore Future Growth Plan, and then have now transitioned to helping us plan for future growth across the whole district. So the first thing that I want to point out is that obviously our community is growing, and our goal here is to develop a 10-year master's facility plan that accommodates the needs of all of our students in a fiscally responsible way. And so it was good that we had the conversation about whether or not to go for a partial tax or bond, because obviously that helps to clarify some of the things that we're thinking about trying to do. So the first thing I need to start off is to talk about how we got here. So in 2008, after a series of studies, the district approved the School Facilities Improvement Plan. And it did so after having a demographic studies, a condition and needs analysis. Then the board also developed 17 guiding principles as well as program standards. So we continue to do demographic studies every single year, and we actually use 2 different firms to do this. And part of the reason why we're using 2 different firms to conduct demographic studies, we have Decision Insight, who currently does our demographic studies, and they're in the process of updating our current one. And then we use Jack Schrader and Associates for consulting with the big master plans that we have. So we have 2 people verifying the numbers at all time, who are working with our architects to make sure that we're done, that we have the information that we need. We've also already completed a conditions and needs analysis. We will be meeting with the cabinet. Gene has already met with principals to talk about what their particular needs are, and we need to make sure that those needs are priorities for cabinet. And then we will be bringing that information back to the board to make sure that these are also priorities that are needed. And one of the things that's interesting, and I think Gene would say this too, is that the needs at the site level are really about the utilization of space and fields, whereas the needs at the district level are about optimizing space and energy efficiency. And so it's really about balancing the 2 different needs across the board. The School Facilities Improvement Plan was actually adopted May 6, 2010, and then a bond came immediately after that. So this is a highlight of all of the district sites. It includes 2 lease sites, Cooper as well, or actually 3 lease sites, Cooper, Wissman, and Slater, which is currently next to Vargas. But it also includes Sylvan Park, which we have the rights to build a school onto 3 of the 9 acres. And so the good thing is that Artique had already designed an urban school model, and so if we chose to build an urban school in that area, we actually could. It doesn't have to be a 700 student school on a 3-acre plot, but we could design a multi-level school there. So this just shows you where everything is. It also includes the future site that was proposed originally by Google in the North Bayshore area. This next slide demonstrates the number of units that are currently under construction throughout the district. And so currently, there are 7,700 units. And what you're looking at is, according to Legend, you can see, and we'll do the 716 because that's the example, it's also the largest one. So 716 are the number of proposed units. And there's a reference number that you can look at that was included in the fact sheet so that you can see what the project actually is. And then this just shows you where the high density is going to come. So East Wissman is a mixed-use development that is that could possibly add an additional 5,000 units. You have the Terabella precise plan that is right next to it, which could be another 2,600. Not included in our current projections because we have no information on it currently are the 1,930 units that are being developed by Moffett Field and NASA. And part of the reason why we don't have information on that is because that is through the federal government and it is not through the city, and we get our information from the city. So as soon as we get more information about what the mix of units looks like, we'll be able to roll that into our actual projects. And then the last one is the largest one, which is the North Bayshore precise plan, which includes 9,850 residential units. The one thing I do want to point out, the difference between the East Wissman plan and the North Bayshore plan is that the North Bayshore plan has a considerable higher number of miniature units or micro units, whereas East Wissman is really more residential in nature in terms of townhomes as well as single attached developments. So in totality, though, there are up to 20,000 units that are going to be built over the next 10 to 15 years. And almost all of them are concentrated in the north and northeast, considering that close to 75% of those units come from 3 master plans: North Bayshore, East Wissman, Moffett Field, and Terabella. That 20,000 units is projected to generate another 2,400 or 2,500 students, 1,500 of them being elementary and 936 of them being middle school students. And as we saw in a presentation earlier, the 936 middle school students is actually larger than any middle school that we currently have. In the 1,500, part of the question, or one of the things that we'll need to consider as we're looking at elementary sites, is that the 1,500 is, if we stay with a 450 student mix, then that means that we actually need 3 sites as opposed to 2. Or the alternative, and this is one of the questions that will eventually come up from the team to the board, is whether or not you want to go to a plan that actually maximizes the site for what it has. And the reason why I say this is, you'll see in a second, is that some sites actually have additional capacities that exceed the 450 target measure that was given by the board originally. And the reason why I think this is important is that schools like Vargas, schools like Mistral, Stevenson, and Castro were built only for 450, or were readjusted to only house 450 students. So they do not have the ability to take on additional capacity at any of those sites. So if, I'll just go back for a second. If you look at the previous slide with the East Wissman precise plan that has 5,000 units, currently Vargas, which is only scheduled to, only has the ability to accommodate 450 students, could not accommodate an additional student coming to it from the East Westman area, even though the East Westman project area is right next door to it. And then I will also, at the end of this meeting, give you a couple updates that have come. I skimmed through the City Council report, so I can give you a couple of items that come from there. So just to give you an idea of how we calculated the numbers, so we looked at the number of units, and each one has a different weight factor. Studios barely produce any students whatsoever. I think total out of the 5,000 units, I think they are scheduled to produce or predicted to produce 46 students across the board. That's because you have to assume that someone will try to live in a studio and will most likely have a kid with them, even though it's only probably 400 something square feet. But the bulk of the students are going to come from rentals and owners. But really, the challenge here is that it is the below market rate units, which is 20% of all housing products, that generates the highest number of students. We did, however, take out any time that we know that there is a senior or disabled community, we do take those out of the mix in order to calculate the total number. And so that currently right now, we know that there are 450 senior units or disabled units that are planned within the development. And so this information right here actually comes from Decision Insight. And there's a reason why you have the 20,000, which is coming from Jack Schrader. And then you have Decision Insights information, which simply says, if things continue on the path that they currently are, which means that the units that have already been approved and are currently being built, we are already projected to see an increase in students across the board, right? And so if you look at, we're currently a little bit over their projection, but by 2023, they're predicting that we should see an additional 500 students that are coming as a result of projects that have already been approved and are already starting to matriculate. So these would be projects that are probably 6 years, that were built 6 years ago and are just now starting to mature. And as you can see, by the time we hit 2028, Decision Insight is already predicting that we will come close to 6,000 students. So why is this important? It's important because we already, if you assume that no additional building takes place in the district, that these 20,000 units that are in the planned or sort of review process or the precise plans are not approved, we already are in a position where we are going to see an increase across the board in our district. And if you were to take this slide all the way back to 2004, what you would notice is the cumulative result since 2004 when we closed the school till now is that we've already seen an increase of 1,000+ students just in that time frame. And so it is easy to assume that because of the additional building that is taking place, that we should see another 1,000 students. Even though the developers will often say, new units don't generate anybody and our kids, these are geared towards a certain demographic. The point is, as that property gets older, you will start to see more and more kids come out of it. So now we started to look at the school capacity. And I think this is where our facilities master plan is going to come into place. So the first thing we need to do is we need to understand what is the maximum capacity that we have. And I want to point out that maximum capacity does not include or account for any other programmatic uses. It does not account for SPED classrooms. It does not account for after-school counseling, preschools, or any of those things. It just simply says that there is a classroom here, and we can use that classroom on an average for 28-something students. And so that it will take place. And then, to give you a good example, Lando's currently has a medical fragile classroom, which actually is 2 classrooms that have been joined together to form the therapeutic side as well as the instructional side. Well, if you look at that layout is, if you put walls back up, you have 2 classrooms plus a storage area, and then there's an RSP room that's in the front of it. So that is technically 2 classrooms, even though we're using it for 1. And so it's important to just keep that in mind as you start looking at these numbers. So for maximum capacity for each one of our sites, you will see that we have currently a maximum capacity at our elementary schools for close to a little bit over 5,000 students. And at our middle school, we have a capacity of about 2,400 students. And if you compare that to the enrollment that we currently have, across all of our sites, there is an excess capacity of 1,500 students for elementary, and then there is an excess capacity of 928. Now again, this is the maximum capacity that exists within the district. The other thing that I want to point out real quick is the classroom density per acre. So there are certain schools where if you are a student, the density is not as great as in other places. So obviously, in our tightest footprint at Vargas, the classrooms per acre is 4.75 classrooms per acre at Vargas Elementary School. Whereas if you're at Landos, the acreage, the classrooms per acre is almost a 2-to-1, right? And so that there's the reason why this is important is that at some of our schools, and if you look at Mistral and Castro, you have 4.2 for each site that are jammed onto a 9.25 acre. So we have 3 examples of some very urban models that exist, but that is not the same across all of our sites. And then we also looked at just sort of the capacity at Wissman. Wissman has 39 classrooms. Slater has 21 classrooms. And then Cooper, and we didn't get the opportunity to examine those. I think we're scheduled to go in and look at them. One of the things I think Cooper will require some extensive reworking in order for it to turn into a school site. So we didn't really count that as capacity. But if we include those, then the capacity there actually gives us an additional 1,600 students or
Wouldn't
seats.
Slater
Seats.
also have to be totally redone?
So Slater is currently, a couple of superintendents ago or a couple of CPOs ago, they were granted a waiver to do renovations to only meet city code and not DSA. And so part of their requirement is that they would have to return it back to its original state. Then we would have to go in and actually have DSA to go through and to approve it. Our last estimate of what it would take to bring Slater up to the minimum code was $18 million, but legislation has changed since then. And so the likelihood of bringing Slater up to code for us to be able to use as a school site is probably somewhere around $25 million.
And I think we did that about 3 years ago before we passed the COP, so.
Right. It, just for comparison's sake, by the time you get into Slater and you start doing renovations and bringing it up to the minimum code, and then you add on top of that the additions that are going to be needed to bring it up to the standard that we have, it's actually cheaper to just tear it down and to build a new school. And I think Artique would actually argue that it would even make more sense to find a way to connect the 2 sites so that it becomes one complete site as opposed to 2 separate entities. But that would be a conversation that we would have a little bit later. And in some cases, if you were trying to acquire a new school, it'd actually be cheaper to tear both of them down and to build a brand new school than it would be to purchase land and then build on top of that. But there are issues with using maximum capacity because The first one is, even though it looks as if we have this capacity to hold all of our schools, the capacity actually doesn't exist in the north side. It actually exists across all of our sites. And so it doesn't, the growth is mainly in the north part of the city. It is not in the southern part of the city. So it's impossible to distribute the kids equally. And then the other thing to consider is that all of our northern schools are actually some of the most dense per acre schools sites across the board. And I think, especially with our elementary schools, not so much with Terabella, but with East Westman and with North Bayshore, I believe the desire is actually to have an elementary school that is within those neighborhoods and within a 1.5 mile walking radius, which is what we currently have right now, as opposed to having it outside of the area. Terabella is a little bit different because Terabella is within walking distance of Therakoff, and technically Therakoff does, you'll see in a second, has the capacity to absorb the possible students that are coming from the Terabella zone. Okay, so now we need to take into account the specific space educational programs like RTI, as well as special education, and then we take into programs like Beyond the Bell, YMCA, Writer School, The Beat, which all use classrooms in different areas. So I want to use Montaloma as an example, and this shows you how complex a school site is being used. So there are 3 Beyond the Bell classrooms that are currently being used over there. There's a RSP, right? And so out of the 27, there's actually 19 rooms that are currently only used for students. And so that 656 student capacity is actually reduced down to 460 unless you start removing some of these programs out of there. And it is possible, and I think both Gene and Bill would agree, that it's possible that we could, you know, maybe remove the computer lab and refigure out and create a smaller RSP room instead of using a larger classroom, or to look at adding a building that may be able to accommodate those. But it doesn't necessarily answer the rest of the question, which is, you know, what do you do with STEAM and RTI, the YMCA, and Beyond the Bell? You have to find space for those. So once we take that into account, what we start to see now is that schools like Huff is currently at a deficit. Bub is also at a deficit in terms of its classroom space once we look at the adjusted versus the actual classrooms. And Castro is actually at a deficit too once you take all the programs in. And so our true capacity, once you add in all our extra programs at the elementary schools across the district, is only 642 students. And just as a reminder, we're projected to add another 1,500 students over the course of all of these projects, but definitely are looking at adding at least 1,000 students K through 8 in the district, based off of current projections. And then the second part of this is that Crittenden and Graham, when you look at their existing capacity, remember that we would need 900 additional seats at the 2 middle schools, and so we only have 676 seats at those current sites. And those are actually evenly distributed at 361, but what we know is that Crittenden is actually the place where the majority of the students would actually end up based off our current zoning practices. So there's a clear need for additional space in our district, or to create additional space in our district to address our growing needs. So we can, in a short term, absorb the near-term growth that's coming. And so we've done a pretty good job with our boundaries, and we should see adjustments across the board. Right now, we're currently looking at how many portables we'll need to keep at our sites, and part of that number is based off of the number of students who were exempted for a year. What's the impact of them? So Bub will actually come back, even though it's over capacity right now, will actually fall under capacity once we remove those students. But in the long term, we need to have a clear solution for how we're going to address the future growth that's coming. And so what we are anticipating is really there is at least a need for close to 2 elementary schools if we base it off our current model of somewhere in the neighborhood of about 450 students. But I would actually suggest that you build larger than that to absorb growth beyond what occurs, because as we're starting to see in our community, older units or older apartment units are being torn down and the density is increasing. And there is still one more industrial area in our community that hasn't started being redeveloped, but it is possible that area north of Montaloma could undergo redevelopment similar to what East Westman and North Bayshore would. At the middle schools, we would need 1,000 more seats, about 500 at each site. And so one of the things that we had to take into account as we were looking at this, and I'm gonna go back for a quick second to our maps. If you look at the first map that we had that I identified where the different school sites were, originally we started looking at the possibility of adding an additional middle school utilizing the Shenandoah property. And so of course the board will have to provide direction on this. But the Shenandoah property is actually close to the Wissman property, and which is less than a mile or so away. And so adding a third school at Shenandoah will cost us somewhere in the neighborhood of $500 million to acquire and to build on. And that's including the escalation. I know they're smiling. I think the numbers are like 400 something million, but $500 million is probably a safe estimate by the time we're going to need it. And so as you saw earlier, our bond program is only for $259 million. So what we could do is we could purchase land at today's rate, and then with a little discount, and then we would have to sit on it until we could figure out how we could actually build something there. It actually makes more sense, and we'll go into this later on when we start working on the future, the master facilities plan. It actually makes more sense to readjust the 2 middle schools and then to readjust boundaries for middle schools and to add seats at the middle schools, which already have all the infrastructure. And part of the reason why is that our middle schools are currently around 16 to 17 acres, and they have everything that we need. They have softball fields, they have a sports pavilion, they have tracks at both of them, right? And so it makes more sense to readjust those as opposed to trying to add those, because those programs actually cost, is what drives the cost up compared to the elementary schools. And so no matter what, you will have to go through a boundary change. But the question is how much parity do you want to create at a third middle school in order to make sure it's even across the board, and what's going to be the cost of that? So that's why we're saying, and it could be that we can look at other sites and add a middle school similar to the way that the district had. I believe Castro was actually slated as a middle school in the past. And so the key here is that we just need 1,000 more seats across the board. And so, so some of these considerations actually have changed since this presentation was approved. So the city actually has now changed their position and actually does take into account in their recent staff report, they do, while what they say is that they don't want to weigh in the debate on student generation, but they used our student generation rates to determine the actual need that is going to come. So that's a good thing. So they acknowledge that the 2,400 students that we're projecting is sort of what the future growth will be over the next 10, they say 10 to 20 years, but they at least are acknowledging that. The second thing is that one of the considerations that the community has expectations in terms of specific programs. I would not argue, I would not advocate for us to move the medically fragile classroom. I think, we just created a state-of-the-art facility. we're in the process of reconfiguring the playground to accommodate medically fragile kids. And so I think that program needs to stay. But when I first arrived, one of the considerations was that that special day classes would be housed at 2 other schools. And so there is an expectation that students are not moving year to year from different school sites in order to accommodate the annual growth across the board. And then there's a consideration as to whether or not the board wants to continue with its smaller school. 450 is is on the smaller side of what our neighboring districts have, but it doesn't mean that every school, there's sort of a range. So you see some small schools, you see some that are a little bit bigger. Obviously, our boundary effects have had a good impact on our smaller sites. We see that there was growth at Castro and Theracov. But whether or not we want to continue to focus on 450 when schools have an additional capacity is a question that needs to come up. Smaller schools do come at a higher operational cost. So it's about $600,000 that you're adding to it. And then the other piece that I want to point out is that smaller schools also require more boundary adjustments. So in order to keep 450 together, you have to undergo a boundary adjustment process. And so last time we did a boundary adjustment process, we spent a couple years doing it because we haven't adjusted boundaries in a long time. Oftentimes what happens is that staff will simply bring a presentation to the board and state that, we have to adjust boundaries in order to accomplish X, Y, and Z board goal. And so it's really a yearly process that takes place. It's not a 3-year lead-in that comes. But in order to accommodate smaller schools, it is possible that we'll have to continue to readjust boundaries in order to maximize school sites or keep them at a capacity around 450. And so there are some questions that we want to pose to the board that will sort of help us in terms of planning. So there were 17 priorities. Those priorities can be conflicting at times, and not every single priority was used. One of the things we would like to bring back is a smaller list of priorities. But some of the things that we are wondering about is what types of things should we include as priorities moving forward. For instance, our neighboring districts all have solar programs, but we do not have solar programs. Solar programs can reduce our operational costs. Well, we've done a good job in all of our buildings of updating the lighting. We did not do things to fix our HVAC, nor do we have solar generating programs which can reduce our dependency from PG&E. The other thing is, should we consider, as we're looking at our priorities, there was, for right or wrong reason, the SFIP was cherry-picked. We went for essentially the bigger projects that really showed the community that we were doing something, and we spread that out to touch every single site. Case in point, we're sitting in a building that was created to accommodate preschool that was at Slater in order to build, well, now Vargas, but in order to build a school, we had to move a preschool, and then we put a new preschool that was right next door, which we're not currently using, but we have to talk about how we want to use it, which means that we added a new district office as a part of all of this. However, the district office was a Tier 4 project. It wasn't a Tier 1 project. And so that's an example. The auditoriums at the middle schools were Tier 4 projects. They were not Tier 1 projects. But the MURs were Tier 1 projects. And so I say this to say that with this last bond program, we really focused on items that really demonstrated to the public that we were really making substantial changes. And these were very visible projects. MURs that are at the front of the schools that are needed are very big items. However, it came at the cost of other things like HVAC units and roofing. And these are the things that no one sort of really wants to champion, like, oh, we need a new roof. You just sort of figure that's going to happen. And so part of our question here is, should we look at uncompleted items and sort of prioritize those? The other thing is, should we think about the accommodation of future growth? We don't get the opportunity to keep going for bond, and our developer fees last year only totaled to $600,000. And so we have to have a way to accommodate the future growth that's coming. Our developer fees are lagging behind again this year. I think last month we only added $19,000 to bring our total up to somewhere around $30-something thousand. And so if we are to redesign our schools, should we find a way to add additional rooms in the event that we have growth that comes? And I think a good example of this is that the Horace Mann School that we visited in San Jose can house around 700 plus students, but there was only 300 students there. And while there are empty classrooms, it didn't necessarily mean that the school wasn't being utilized to its fullest capacity. It just wasn't being maximized in terms of its students that were in there. Another question that we have is, are you really comfortable with a North Bayshore elementary site of 2 to 3 acres? So we met Greystone West, Artique, Jack Schrader, as well as staff to talk about what is really doable. And so while we believe that 2 to 3 acre urban school model is doable, it's a very compact campus. And so Horace Mann was actually 3.5 acres, and there were a lot of adjustments that were made in order to make Horace Mann work. But everyone sort of settled on the 6 to 7 if it is really a more ideal space. But we want to know from the board about, so that we can put in our master's facility plans, especially for North Bayshore and East Westman, what is the amount of acres that we're actually looking for? And so we're just asking, are you really comfortable with a 2 to 3 acre site, or would you like to see it around 6 to 7? Another question we have is, how large can schools get? Do you want us to look at the possibility of maximizing school space, or do you want to sit around the 450 mark? And then this question is really about how we redistribute students in the future. So this is all future. But as we think about future growth, should one of our considerations be leased sites or other sites that do not have any active programs on it? Sites like Sylvan, Cooper, are those sites that we want to investigate also in terms of, as we look at growth and we're developing a plan for each particular area, do we think that, for the central area, that creating a satellite campus or a smaller campus at a place like Sylvan is beneficial to us? Or, is it possible that when we think about the East Westman, and if acquiring a property is too cost prohibitive, should we look at the lease site, which is Slater, and design a master plan or design a plan of action to reconfigure those two campuses so that it can accommodate additional students? So just real quick to wrap this up. So the next thing we're doing is we're researching options for growth. We're starting outreach towards the community starting tomorrow through Thought Exchange to see what areas that the community wants to prioritize, and we're doing that through October and November. We will bring that back. Our goal is to bring that information back at the first meeting in November. We also will start to develop a draft school facilities improvement plan. We will be at City Council to talk about their school strategy next week. And then at the November 7th meeting, we want to present a draft plan, and that way we'll have some questions for you in terms of options. For instance, the middle school option is one of the questions we will have, and we will present all types of scenarios. So if you choose to build a third school, we'll say this is what we believe the estimates of the costs are, but these are also the unintended consequences that come with it. Or if you choose to build at the two schools to change the configuration, we'll have a couple examples of what that looks like, including one that means a complete redesign of the whole campus to make it a little bit more functional, what we believe the cost of that is, and what the impact of that will be so that you're just aware of everything, with a goal of adopting a school facilities improvement plan at the November 21st meeting. And if you choose to approve a bond, you would do the bond at the same meeting. So that concludes staff's report.
Thank you, Dr. Rudolph. We have questions from trustees. Trustee Gutierrez?
Yes, Dr. Rudolph, so for the increase in size for certain schools, I know some of them are prohibited because of space, and I'm thinking more about the choice schools. But would we, in the case of Stevenson, be able to expand that and also Mistral, or are they just stuck at where they're at now?
So I think if we look at the density question, so Stevenson and Mistral are really two different animals across the board. Stevenson currently sits on about 17 acres, even though it is shared across multiple sites. And it does have a pretty sizable field that is shared amongst two schools. Whereas Castro is really on a denser site. It's on 9.25 acres. I think Castro and Mistral are really at their capacity. The only way, and you know, I think Gene and Bill, you're more than welcome to come up to the microphone and chime in too. I think the only way that you could accommodate more students at Mistral is if you actually redesign Mistral to follow a more urban footprint and sort of similar to what Castro is, and really maximize space a little bit more, as opposed to its current configuration, which is really just two schools that happen to occupy the exact same space. But Gene, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, there's a couple of issues relating to density and capacity. One of them is parking, pickup, drop off. A lot of the schools really suffer from that issue. And Mistral, Castro share campus, the Stevenson, Therakoff district office. What happens with the former district office? There's a lot of competing uses, and that's why the density of it is high, even though it's a big site, 16.9 acres. The real areas where you have, I think, opportunities to increase density without really changing and actually improve a lot of the aspects of this campus are Bub, Huff, and Landals. They both suffer from really awkward front yard areas. The diagonal that's created by the front building creates really inefficient pickup, drop-off, parking. All the sites suffer from deficit areas. You can actually, you can build higher, going to 2 stories selectively. But the other campuses are, particularly Vargas, Mistral, Castro, they're pretty much bursting at the seams. And, Therakoff, Stevenson probably have some capacity, but then you'd have to demo in place and rebuild in place. They don't really have the capacity to fill in. I think Stevenson really suffers from the lack of landscaping. It's more the qualitative aspects of some of the schools. And that's what we heard from some of the principals, is they're really focused on the qualitative aspects of many of their schools. So that's just to talk about density.
Okay, so in terms of trying to expand on Stevenson though, is that not an option that we can think about? Because the way I look at it is if we have a chance to, if you think it's better for us to just go ahead and possibly tear down Vargas to build a better suited campus there because of numbers, will we be able to do the same at Stevenson so that we could have more capacity to distribute to kids who may want to go to Stevenson as opposed to other schools in general, because everybody's going to be impacted anyways, right? And I know it's a touchy situation, but I'd rather just bring it up now so that we can cover all of our bases and just pose that question to the board so that we can get a conversation going on that front.
I think there's always a possibility, if you want to just demo buildings, we can always demo anything and sort of reconfigure them. I think Stevenson and Therakoff are unique that they truly are two separate entities that sort of exist in their own worlds. And I think if we could go back in time, we probably would, we wouldn't put a preschool here, nor would we put a district office here. We would look for some other place, and you would really separate the two campuses a little bit more because they're actually pretty close to each other. and sort of redesign it so that even the traffic patterns wouldn't sort of coexist. Because currently right now at Stevenson, you have a traffic pattern where they're all using the same road to go into both sites, even though we tried to extend it and sort of help Stevenson out. And actually Stevenson, I mean, they come into the back of the district also too. So I think there is a possibility to do it. In terms of expansion, you know, I think if you don't demo, then expansion really comes at the cost of either the preschool or by adding temporary portables on the backside of the campus, or additional portables. You can't turn Stevenson into a 2-story building without demoing the Enviroplex. And so Stevenson, unfortunately, if you want to add more seats and demo something and not really do anything to reconfigure it, it ends up looking like Vargas. That's probably the only way. So yes, we can add. I mean, we could always, if the board wishes to open up the 10 portables that are sitting right next to us, you can always add those as additional spots. But it does come at a cost to other sites. And you can already see, just in terms of enrollment, you already have some issues where you're running some pretty small sites. With the exception of Vargas, it doesn't have a 5th grade. You're running some sites that are really at the smallest capacity that we can have before they become truly inefficient. And so adding additional capacity to Stevenson would have that impact. I also would think that just knowing the Stevenson community, they may actually be resistant to having the school become so large that they would feel like they would lose a part of what their community is. So I think there's a lot of investigation that we would need to do if that's the direction of the board.
Okay, thank you for addressing that. My response to the third bullet, which is, are we comfortable with the North Bay Shore site of 2 to 3 acres? No, I'm not. I'd rather go for the 6 to 7. And I know, I think the last time Google stopped by at the end of last year, they didn't promise or solidify their offering of the last site proposal anyways. I asked them, if you were ready to do this now, could we make it happen? And their response was, well, there may be other sites too. So I don't have a strong commitment from them on that front. So because of that, I'd rather just go for the larger acreage size. And if 6 and 7 is available with the help of the city, I'm all for that.
So we're still in the question phase. I have a few questions. I'm curious what, we had part of your question was about energy efficiency in the first bullet point. And I'm curious, what are the startup costs for initiating a solar program, and what would be the eventual annual cost savings?
So we're currently estimating a full solar project of about $10 million. It's actually, I think it was actually around 7 to 8, 7. Thank you. Okay. 7, but it depends on when you capitalize on that. So if you say 10 million, one of the things we did when we were looking at our emergency preparedness program for the power outages, one of the things we talked about is we may need to go back to the middle schools and add storage facilities, because what we realize is that the way our facilities are currently running, all the food is stored at the 2 middle schools, and then it's distributed out to the elementary. And so if power goes out, which is one of the concerns we had, we actually lose money because the food becomes unusable or is perishable. So, but a $7 to $8 million bond program is what you're looking at if you plan on buying the program outright. It's savings over the life of the program is close to $35 million, with an annual savings of about $500,000 a year.
Okay, thank you.
The other thing I would say is that part of the reason why we have it on hold is that some of the direction that you give us may change the actual program. So for instance, part of code now requires all new buildings to be built to be solar ready. If you were to redesign the 2 middle schools, there's no point in putting solar programs at those sites because you would end up just tearing them down. But you could add them to certain areas within the elementary schools. One of the things we've looked at is shade structures, especially at Stevenson and Vargas, where there are no trees whatsoever for kids. And so we would look at things like that, and so we would do it in a sort of a tiered approach. But right now, under our current program, is about $500,000.
Okay, thank you. Another question I have is on this issue of boundaries, and the last process we had took roughly 3 years, as you mentioned. What do our neighboring districts do? Do they just adjust as population is needed? That's the overarching.
Right. So when Santa
approach.
Clara opened a school right across the street from me in Central Park, I just got a letter saying that your boundaries are going to change. Here's a community forum that we're going to have to hear your thoughts. Whether or not, and actually our PIO, who she got a similar letter, and she got the same information from Santa Clara to see how they communicated out. But it's really just your boundaries going to change. Here's what's going to happen. Here's the school that you're going to go to, and it goes into effect the next year. I can tell you that in North Carolina, the Charlotte Mecklenburg actually built a school right around the corner from my children's school, Davidson. And so they ended up going to Croft. Again, it takes a little bit less time to build the actual school because it was just all open land, but we got a letter one year saying we're building the school. Your boundary's going to change. At the end of the year, the school opened up. There's sort of a welcome, and the next year you were there. There's not a 3-year adjustment period that takes place, and it's a very elongated process for it.
Okay, thank you. My last question is, if we were able to pay off the COP with the bond we are hoping to pass, wouldn't that free up some of our leased sites? Because we wouldn't need that additional revenue to pay off the COP, so that would essentially free up those as land and school site options.
It frees up your dependency on the lease sites.
Okay.
So each site has different terms to it. The Slater site is a little bit more amenable because I believe it requires an 18-month lead-in. The Cooper site, not the Cooper site, well, actually Cooper is similar, but the Wisman site requires that the earliest that you can provide notice is 2025 with a 5-year notice for 2030. And then the district has to do a couple of things in order to help relocate the school. And then there are some fees that are associated with it that come along.
Okay.
But paying off the COP does make it a little bit more favorable for the district if we needed to reuse those sites. Currently, I wouldn't suggest that we entertain eliminating either one of those leases, because otherwise the money from the COP would have to come directly from the general fund, which means that we're taking money away from kids, and currently we're not doing that.
Right. Okay, thank you. Other questions from trustees?
Do you have Sorry, I wasn't on. Do you have a list of the uncompleted items from the last bond?
Yeah, one of the things we did when we began is we met with Greystone West and the MOT, and we went through all the projects that were on the list, identified which ones were completed in total, which ones were partially completed, and then which ones were not completed. And then we went through a process of reviewing with the principals and with the Greystone West and with different subject matter folks within the district, of the ones that were partially completed, is the balance of the project still needed? Is it still a priority? We had them sort of rank the projects. And then of the uncompleted projects, are they still needed? And if so, is it needed in the same sort of configuration or scope? And then we also had them identify other projects that were not on the list that they would like to have done. So that's all in this list that we have compiled for different schools. We met with, and then sat down with the principals and and Greystone West and MOT and other folks, and had them, you know, rank by priority the projects that are still remaining.
Am I not finding that in the packet for some reason?
It wasn't included in the packet because what we experienced a couple years ago was sort of a line item going through each one. And so if you want uncompleted items to move up in terms of priorities, we would come back, if that's the direction, we would come back with a list. We would include those as part of the tiered projects and say, these are the ones we view as really essential of uncompleted projects to go. There are some like fences that were on there. Fences may not be the top priority for a district. I don't know if you want to give an example of another one.
Yeah, so we took those lists. We've provided, you know, we did cost estimates. We did quantitative takeoffs and descriptions, provided them to a cost estimator. And we do have sort of notional costs for all the projects that are remaining. So we're probably somewhere north of $300 million in terms of projects escalated to 2024. And in terms of priority 1, about 130 million, priority 2, about 90 million, and then priority 3, priority 4. Priority 1 and priority 2 projects are ones where you really had a champion for it, either a principal or, you know, preschool director or you know, special ed or MOT or technology. Priority 3 and priority 4 were projects that kind of had not been completed, but people said, you know, it's still good to keep on the list, but there's no particular champion for it. So of the priority 1 and priority 2 projects, it's roughly about $230 million right now.
One thing I want to point out, though, is that depending on the direction that you give, some of those items actually come off the list. So, for instance, if you want to redesign both of the middle schools, you eliminate almost all those items like roofs, HVAC units, because you're redoing the whole building, and you know, so it changes the cost estimate of everything.
Yeah, the lens that we did when we were meeting with the principals and folks within the district was not and did not include the overlay of growth. And in terms of, you know, if we wanted to add 6 classrooms here or add, add 8 classrooms here, you know, these were really focused on really improving their existing campuses. So the goalposts will shift depending on what the districts and boards, you know, the priority is in terms of how you address growth.
Well, and if I remember correctly, when we spoke with Google in the very last session of our school year last year, they were looking at, you know, shovels in the ground in 3 to 4 years or 5 years, that it was a ways out before the housing itself even started to get built. And so I'm wondering how much of the, I guess my question is, how much of the growth, I know you're asking us for priorities, but it's hard to know how much of the growth we need to look at funding and beginning changes in our schools now versus when those units are going to come online and we actually have those students.
So ideally, by the time you see a building come up, you're too late in order to adjust for growth. Because even if you take into the maturation rate of a particular property, you still have a 3 to 4 year lead-in for your own building and acquisition of sites, and that's assuming that you're using a new site. If you add in, and we saw this with our current project, if you add in an existing site that you're trying to work on, the strain at that campus is a lot greater because you have to readjust everything and the work hours that you can use. And I think Montaloma is a good example. It's taken us longer to work on Montaloma than it took to build Vargas. The reason why is because we had students on that particular site. And so you can't do things like roofs or anything else. Whereas and really, to get to your point, if you're designing a plan for future growth, essentially what you're doing, what you're asking us to do or directing us to do is really to say, we know that it's projected that 5,000 kids are going to come from, you know, the East Westman area. Option 1, plan A, would be first to find a site within that area. and that becomes our priority. In the event that you can't find that site, we need to have a backup plan to understand what you would do at a site that is nearby and what are the implications of that. And if you look at our original SFIP, what you'll see is that actually RT stated you want to start going through each of your elementary schools and turning them into two-story schools. And they did the same thing for the middle schools to say these particular buildings need to be 2 stories in order to accommodate future growth. And that's essentially what you would be telling us.
Yeah, we have thought quite a bit about, when the majority of those 20,000 units are going to come online. Clearly, that's not going to be within the next 3 to 5 years, and that's why, Allende had that one bullet where, you do have excess capacity right now in the system, and so that's probably sufficient to address near-term needs within 3 to 5 years. But you can, assuming that market cycles are constant, that probably in a 7 to 10 year period, you need to know how you're going to address the growth, and you need about a 3 to 5 year lead time, so that depending on what that strategy is in terms of, is it taking back leases, is it redeveloping on campuses, and the extent of that decision making needs to happen 3 to 5 years before you expect that growth to hit. And so basically, I think the horizon is probably around 2030. You really need to have your strategies in place by 2025 in terms of how you're going to address it.
Okay.
So that the time to start making those decisions is now, in terms of, you have some lease term, lease maturity rate, dates. How are you going to do extensions? Do you do another 10, 15-year extension, or do you do 5, 7-year extensions? And so that when you'll have your assets in place to address the growth when you need it.
One additional point is that companies like Sobrato actually plan on having all their residential built by 2022. So their goal is 2021 to break ground for the first school, 2022, and they just got approved last year.
Wait, you're talking about pair development?
Yes. So they're trying, and I think that's what you're going to see from developers that have a lot of liquid capital. They will try to move as quickly as possible to capitalize on residencies. And then once a building is built, you assume that they will really start generating kids 5 years after that. So by 2027, PAIR will be generating students for our district.
Okay.
Yeah, so some of the really key decisions that in the near term that I think we've identified is at the elementary school level, finding a solution for North Bayshore. If North Bayshore takes care of itself, then the issue becomes, one of the nice things about the district is you do have considerable assets in the Northeast with your leased properties. So you do have Slater, you do have Wissman, and on their own, you can address the need coming out of East Wissman and Moffett Field. So at the elementary school, you kind of have and those leases all kind of mature before in the late 2020s, 2027, 2028, et cetera. The bigger question is at the middle school level. One of the hidden opportunities of the middle schools is that you have district functions that are on the middle school campuses which really don't really want to be on the middle school campus. You have the MOT transportation yard at Crendon, you've got the space yard and the offices for MOT at Graham, you've got preschools at Graham. So by virtue of their location on those campuses, if you can find a solution for MOT and you can find a solution for that consolidates preschools, then it unlocks some underutilized areas of those campuses. The other advantage that you have is by having surpluses on some of the campuses right now, you do have available swing space to where you can redevelop in the near term without having to put kids into portables. And so think of the surplus as a near-term opportunity and take advantage of it, because if you get to the capacity and you try to redevelop, then it's going to get expensive.
Other questions from trustees? Are there members of the public that wish to address the board on this item? I think now we'll move on to comments and possibly move through the bullet points. Trustee Blakely, do you want to start?
Sure. So as far as the priorities and energy efficiency, that is important to me. It has been all along. And I thought I had not appreciated that the uncompleted items were the projects on the old master facilities plan or the current master facilities plan. I thought we were talking about things like shade structures, the solar, and like the roofs and HVAC, but it sounds like the list was longer than that. And I was just going to make the comment that things like HVAC and roofs, I don't want to spend a lot of money replacing a roof if we're going to tear the building down. But there may be steps that we need to take anyway, because I don't know, you want to replace the whole roof, but like if it's not going to happen for a few years and it's leaking, I don't want the teachers to have to move buckets around. So I don't know if there's a kind of temporary or interim fixes that we can do for some of those issues if they crop up.
Yeah, one of the things we noticed when we looked at the list of uncompleted projects is that they tended to be a lot of, as Allende was alluding to, sort of utility projects, rerouting conduits, utility surveys, stuff that didn't have a high contact, direct benefit, And so those projects are all at the forefront because there are increasing problems with the utilities, like at Therikoff, Montaloma. The situational awareness of the condition of underground utilities is not good.
As we've learned.
And everything's kind of near approaching the end of their service life. So those projects really are all priority 1, priority 2, as we've been talking to people.
And as we're learning at Vargas, they can take a long time because we can't always control the parties that we need to work with, right? So I appreciate that comment, and I would certainly, those would be the kind of things I guess I'd like to get out in front of so that we're not waiting when we've already got kids in the school to get the power hooked up.
Just at the first meeting in November, we'll be able to bring this back. So originally this presentation would have been a week later, which would give us more time to bring in all the results. Because we moved it up to have to address the city's conversation, we didn't have the opportunity to really dive in and to sort of unpack it. We still had a couple meetings left. So at the November meeting, we'll, and this goes to Devin, Trustee Conley's point too, we'll be able to bring sort of a idea of what that looks like so that you're aware. And then from there, not that you would say this line item, but we really feel like these are some priorities that need to be higher on the list versus these, and we'll try to group them so that you're making the decision about, oh, we value the aesthetics more than we value energy efficiency. And that means that all of the aesthetics projects would move up to the top versus the energy efficiency projects.
I value both, but I definitely want to be energy efficient. And some of this goes to the next question, should accommodation of future growth be added? I think yes, but I also don't want to overbuild because I think some of the new housing is going to take a very long time. I don't know if Terabella is going to get built out to 2,500 units, and I wouldn't want to go building, huge schools that, even though like the one that we visited in San Jose, it's only half occupied right now. I mean, if there's ways to do it in a smart way, like build the foundation so that you could add a second story without having to redo the foundation, but if we don't need the second story right away, maybe not put that on. I don't know, that may not be a good example, but okay, so you're shaking your head no. Yeah.
It's like, just codes change. So, what you don't want to do is build foundations and then go into a new code cycle and find out that now you have to redo the foundations.
Okay.
So I think if you can phase things over a code cycle, which is generally about 4 years, then I think you've got some ability to do that. But I think it's pretty risky to push it out beyond that.
Okay, well, it may be, I'm not an expert in this and I would rely on you, but it may be that we do have phased plans. So we would plan develop something, but with a third phase, we're gonna do phases 1 and 2 now. And if we need to, if that growth comes on, then we'll, earmark a third phase for a particular site, something like that.
Right. So,
Yeah.
yeah, so ideally what we would do is we would start off with if you're saying, look, to address the future growth that's going to occur in the East Westman area, our first priority is to find a school site within East Westman. So that's what we would prioritize, and that's what we would focus on.
Okay.
But if Plan B is that in the event that you can't, then we would look at the viability of, do you want to prioritize using our existing sites that we currently have, which is currently only one. So do we want to look at Vargas and find ways to make that a larger site? Or do you want to look at the possibility of looking at Vargas and knowing that the Slater lease is going to end at a certain year? So do you want to adjust that way? So that's option 2. Do you prefer to, because the growth could take quite some time, do you want to look at the Westman site as a possibility, right? And so now you start building different options, and as we go through, what you want, and I think Artique would argue this too, you want to be able to say, for option A is always going to be the preferred route, right? Find a site, the city helps us to acquire it, like everybody likes that option. But if you're not, and you have to go to Slater and Vargas, then you really need a plan of action that says conceptually this is what it's going to look like, and these are the priorities that are going to drive it. And then from there, we have an idea of what we're going to work with, and when it's time to build, it may look different, but at least we have a conceptual idea of how you should approach it, and we should adhere to that conceptual idea a little bit more faithfully than what we did the first time around.
Yeah, I think if I can add, with regards to growth, it's really not specific individual decisions about how you build, particularly at elementary school sites. It's really going to be, like Ayeni was alluding to, are you looking for new land sites? How are you approaching your leases? And how do you do extensions? Do you do extensions to give you the flexibility so that you're not waiting, you don't do a 12 or 15-year lease, you do a 5 or 7-year lease, so that you have options. Then having the leases mature at different periods, so that you've got options depending if growth accelerates or decelerates. You always have that. That's really your ace in the hole.
Right.
And so it's more at the middle school in terms of if we're not looking to acquire 16 to 17 acres at $15 million an acre, then what is our strategy to recapitalize Crittenden and Graham, and finding a facility solution for MOT and preschool. So it's not so much, I think, at the level that you're thinking, Laura, but I think it's going to be a bigger picture. How are we managing our leases? How are we managing our sites?
Okay. I hadn't appreciated that gloss based on the questions that were presented, but I hear your approach. I think we need to keep the leased sites, in mind, because they're in good locations. And they are already staggered, so, I think we can't lose sight of that. I don't know, if the city could help us acquire a site, great. But based on everything I've been hearing, I think focusing on the middle schools in the current sites and making those denser probably makes a lot more sense. I don't know where we'd put another MOT, but, there's a lot of good minds thinking about this. So, and then the 2 to 3 acre site in North Bayshore, I would prefer something larger. I've said that all along. But visiting the sites that we did, I see how that can work. So especially, we were looking at 2 schools over there, and then all of a sudden the conversation just became 1. And if it's 1, I think a 6 or 7 acre site or even a 5 acre site would make more sense, because to your conversation about density, it'd be pretty dense if you put a 700 student school, on a 2 or 3 acre site. I think it would be much more favorable to have a site that was a bit larger, maybe not as big as the 10, but.
Yeah, I think that with regards to North Bayshore, I think it's going to become an either or. If you want location, then you're going to have to live with a certain size. If you want the size, then you have to compromise on location. So it's really you know, that's kind of been the dilemma is if you want that area, then you're going to be farther from your residents. If you want to be everybody within walking distance, then it's going to be a certain size. So that might be some of the dynamics in terms of the discussions with Google.
I'm certainly open to the smaller schools, but my preference would be to have it. The one that they were showing us was in Joaquin, and what's the third? There's Pear, Joaquin, and Shorebird. It seemed like there might be room for a larger site in Shorebird. That's a little farther away, but it's still walking distance to Joaquin and Pear. So how large can the schools get? I'm definitely open to increasing the size. I already alluded to the middle schools getting larger. I mean, I don't think it's like a perfect world, but I think that's the practical world given the constraints that we're in. And I don't think our elementary schools need to be exactly 450 students. My kids attended ones that were a little bit over 500, and that wasn't a problem. So I think we need to be a bit flexible on that. And current sites versus lease sites, I guess we've already talked about that a bit. So
I'll
Trustee
go
Wheeler?
next. And it's interesting to hear, Trustee Blakely, I agree with much of what you said, so I'm just going to quickly go down this list. And let me say, this is the easiest to understand list you've ever given us in a board packet. So I'm going to just quickly go down my answers. So what priorities should exist? Energy efficiency, yes. Uncompleted items from the last bond, as many as make sense today. Should accommodation of future growth be added? I would say yes. Are we comfortable with a North Bay Shore Elementary site of 2 to 3 acres? I would say yes. How large can schools get? I'm happy with schools over 450. And should we redistribute among current sites only or include leased sites? I think at this point in time it makes sense to include leased sites in our calculations.
Thank you, Trustee Wheeler. Trustee Holly?
Sure. I think, you know, it was really interesting going through this packet this week. We really are the stewards of this infrastructure for the children in our community. And that means that there should be a high priority on the things that make that infrastructure sound and safe. So roofs, HVAC. When we talk about energy efficiency now, I think about solar, I think about not just efficiency, but also PG&E shutting everything down. And like, what about our medically fragile class at Landals? What would they have done today if we didn't have electricity? I'm not sure. So I think solar needs to be a priority so that we can start to have that capacity within our district ourselves. Just thinking towards the future. Looking for forward to future growth, I am interested in maintaining schools at the elementary level that students can walk to. That 1.5 mile radius, I think, is really important. And that means that sometimes the school size might be 450, but sometimes the school size, when we look at Joaquin and Shorebird and the plans out there, we were saying 6,700 because that's how many students we thought that area would generate. And so I'd rather have the walkability be the guidepost for the school size at the elementary school level so that we maintain, again, that's environmentally more responsible too. As we have higher density housing, we're gonna have more kids that live within walking distance of a school. And I think that's okay. I think we can handle that. I don't wanna go too big. Like, I think over 700 might be a little uncomfortable for elementary school. For the middle schools, and when we talk about future growth, I do think we should look at reconfiguring Crittenden possibly first because it is closer to that side of the city. If we can get a site in the North Bay Shore location that's walkable, and we can reconfigure Crittenden first, that will at least get us on the sort of the leading edge of the growth that we see coming. And then phasing in, building out Graham to be a larger capacity later on, I think would come. You know, again, back to this idea of stewarding the assets that we have for our students and community, the lease sites, there's a reason those sites weren't sold. And they were leased to generate income for the COP, but if we can wipe out the COP and we can look at using those sites for the students in the district in another way that may be even more cost efficient down the road because we wouldn't be buying new property, I think that's a good thing. I think, and then as to the size of the North Bayshore Elementary site, if we can get a larger site there, then absolutely we should. But again, this walkability aspect, like I think we need to have the schools where the kids are.
Thank you, Trustee Conlon.
Oh, sorry, I have one more. I'm so sorry. I know we have a list. You guys have done a lot of work, it sounds like, on prioritizing the projects that were not completed. And this is such a tiny thing. The Mistral front office was supposed to be renovated, and we went out for a bid in the spring of last year.
It's a priority one project.
Okay, all right, thank you. I just wanted to make sure it was still in there.
Yeah.
Because it was high up on the list, and then it's the one thing that we ran out of
It's the one
contingency
project. You know, I think as we walked through all the campuses, it was really impressive to see how far those funds were spread. You know, basically everything was touched. The Mistral administration was the one outlier.
Okay.
So that's,
Okay.
yeah, at the head of the list.
All right, thank you.
Trustee Gutierrez?
Yeah, so energy efficiency is important, but in terms of the uncompleted items from the last bond, I think it depends on how we target what's important. So if we can focus on expansion of Crittenden and the redesign of that, just like Trustee Conley's mentioned, I'd support that, along with re-examining our lease to see if we can have a greater impact on the Vargas site. And then start thinking about the possibilities of what Wisman holds for us. Because if it's going to be a gradual increase, like like it looks like, then if we can factor all those elements together, then you've got planned growth that would help you in the assistance of serving the children that are coming from that area first, right? And then hopefully, based on that, then you have a better idea of where you're going to have property be given to you, possibly through the city and Google, and at either Shoreboard or somewhere else, but within the 6 to 7 acre range, and not 2 to 3. I know 2 to 3 works, but that's not my priority. I'd feel more comfortable with having a school that actually looks like a school. Let's see, future growth. Again, if we tie all that in together, that's part of it, right? How large can schools get? It depends on the school and the capacity that it has. If we're thinking about reconfiguring some schools, if we can build them up to 650 or 700, I'm fine with that. It just depends on the layout and what the end goal is and how much money we have. And then, I mean, that's basically it, right? The only other thing that I'd bring up, though, that's not here is for the MOT and for whatever we have on the left-hand side of Graham in the back. I mean, we got other spaces that we can use, I would think. Maybe we can explore those to see if they can house both of those two locations and see what that would look like. And I'd feel comfortable with having that approach be also thought about by the board and by the DO and yourself, so that we can have at least a plan for how would that look like, how much would it cost, and what relationships do we have to build to make that happen.
Thank you, Trustee Gutierrez. I agree with most of what's been presented. Energy efficiency should be a priority. I think we should go through the uncompleted items from the last bond with the lens of don't repair roofs on structures we think we're going to be tearing down in the future, and or HVACs on systems that, you know, we're going to be changing. We should be accommodating for future growth. I had the similar thought to what you did, which was Crittenden first, and classrooms at Crittenden first. If we have all of the, it's a very large campus. I think you could add a bank of classrooms without too much additional, and I'm not a facilities person, so I could be wrong, but you could do with too much additional, like, supporting facilities. So just to try to look at costs of that, because when I heard that the entire bond we might go out for would be eaten up by getting both middle schools up to speed, I was like, clearly that's not an option. So then I thought Crittenden, and then I thought, well, how do you even scale that? I get this is very prescribed, but that could be an approach to consider. I would prefer a 6 to 7 acre school in North Bayshore. If we want to go 2 to 3, I would be more comfortable doing that at a K2 site at one site and a secondary 2 to 3 acre site for 3 to 5. How large can schools get? We have our largest campuses where the growth will not be occurring. I'm not averse to having larger schools. I just don't want to see the growth occurring at our larger sites and having people drive across town just to get there. It creates a whole new suite of problems that we've just recently been able to solve. So that kind of feeds into the last question of redistribution on current sites. I'm very much a fan of this. We can change boundaries when it's necessary without having to go through an extensive input process from the public. If that means we need to change boundaries as growth comes online to fill Mauna Loma, which has space, that's great. Therakoff, and looking at the lease sites, once we pay off the COP, I think that is what was this event horizon for the longer term? That's the 10 to 15 year plan in my mind. So hopefully that gives you enough information to proceed.
Yep.
Okay, thank you, trustees. I think we're going to need a motion to extend the meeting, as our last item I've been told might run up to an hour.
So I move that we extend the possibility of the ending portion of our meeting till 10:30.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay, on a motion made by trustee Wheeler and seconded by trustee Conley, the motion passes 4-1 with trustee Gutierrez dissenting. Okay, Dr. Rudolph, we'll go to item E, the CASP report.
Okay, 10:30. Got it. We'll make it work.
Talk fast.
Talk fast. All right. So I'm here presenting the California student, the test scores. Currently, our chief academic officer is out sick, and so she asked me to take the presentation. So it's not that she was killing herself that she couldn't be here, and I told her that I would inform the public as well as the board that unfortunately she just can't make it today. So the first thing, and I am going to sort of fly through this a little bit quickly. Before I jump into this, the actual presentation, I do want to highlight the fact that earlier this year, Sean Reardon, Linda Darling-Hammond, and the Learning Policy Institute did recognize us for being one of 54 schools that are really making sizable gains with our minority population, specifically Latino students. And I think that is illustrated in what you're about to see for the public. And I know the state just came out with their, they were talking about how they improved their test scores by 0.9%, and that's great, but we've been doing a pretty good job over the last couple of years, and our staff has been working really hard and to make this happen. And so I'm really proud to work beside everybody every single day to get this. So we want to make sure that our kids are prepared for high school and 21st century schools, but we also want to eliminate achievement gaps for all of our kids. And so the CAS score, the CAS is actually just the state testing, is an acronym, the California Assessment for Student Performance. It is a part of the Smarter Balanced Assessments, which means that there are ELA and mathematics assessments in grades 3 through 8. And then there are alternative assessments if you, for other kids. And then there's also a science assessment, which we really don't talk about that much, but there is a science assessment that occurs in 5th, 8th, and 10th grade. All right, and again, I'm going to go through this to get to the meat of it. This is a computer adaptive test, so it reflects how kids perform, and it adjusts the questions with the highest jumps occurring at the beginning, just like any computer adaptive test, and towards the end, it is really just using the questions to sort of hone in on what the student's particular score is. It also looks at growth from year to year, and those are reported out to students. And so we do not have our science test yet. Those don't come out until winter, and that's also part of the reason why we don't really talk about it to the same level that we talk about the ELA and the math. Okay, so let's jump into the results. The first thing is that we have about 3,200 students that are tested in our district, which is up from the first year that we gave CAS, which is about 31%. One of the questions that was raised was that, well, part of the reason why you're seeing gains is because the demographics are changing. Actually, our demographics are pretty much staying the same across the board. What you are seeing, though, is some slight changes in certain demographics, but not anything that is substantial enough. And we did just have a bubble come through our district of enrollment that just went out the door in 8th grade. And so we saw this when I first arrived, that there was this group of kids that came from in the 2015 year that were sort of matriculating through. But for the most part, our demographics have stayed the same, even though Hispanic Latino have dropped by a little about 170-something students. Socioeconomically disadvantaged students, that one, as we heard earlier, is sort of a misnomer because people are not qualifying for free and reduced lunch simply because of the of the national average, not because that they're fleeing our area. And then the other thing I want to point out is that our English language and our reclassified students are really tied to each other. So the increase in reclassified students impacts the number of students who are qualified as English language learners. So the first thing that I want to point out is that a comparison from where we are compared to the county as well as the state. And as you can see, Mountain View over the course of the 5 years has improved by 11%, whereas the state has increased by 7%. And actually the most sizable gain that they had was in year one from 2015 to 2016. And since then, they have only increased by about 2 percentage points. Whereas we have continued to we have 1 year where we stayed flat, but we've continued to go on an upward trajectory. The county, on the other hand, has improved. Also, again, slightly, it moved up 4 points in the first year, and then it stayed sort of flat and has only improved 1 percentage point. And so what that says is that we're really doing something different here in Mountain View compared to our peers. This breaks down just, as you can see, us compared to the county in terms of how we're dealing with our socioeconomic students. We've obviously made some sizable gains. In the first year, we were at 31% for SED students, and we've increased by 12% over the course of the time. English language learners, we always talk about this as a moving target, just because as you reclassify kids, they sort of move out into a different category. But the one I do want to highlight, which is the one that a lot of people struggle with, which is our students with disabilities. We've actually seen sizable increases across the board with them improving by 10%. So for, again, white, Asian, and Hispanic Latino, we've seen some sizable gains there. For Latino growth, we've increased by 15% compared to 11% in ELA across for all students. In math, we're seeing a similar story. As you can see, for the state, it's only been a 7% increase, whereas for the district, we had a 10% increase. And for the county, it's been a 5% increase. So this year, we were flat, which is our first time, but we did see sizable gains, and I'll talk about those in 5th grade. But we are, and that is one of the adjustments we're making to the LCAP, is what are we going to do about math across the board? And so we are adding additional supports at certain sites, including targeted supports at 2 of our elementaries. Again, you can see that for the district, we've seen gains with our SED students, as well as our, again, students with disabilities that increased by 10%. Our English language learners in terms of math was sort of a little bit on the flat side, and so we need to do a little bit more work there with those students. And then we see, again, similar gains for our Latino students, but also it's worth pointing out that our Asian students are actually showing increase. They've increased by 9% since the start, and they've been on a steady rise. The most important thing is often we're compared to our peers that are right next door to us. So how are we doing compared to Los Altos, Cupertino, Palo Alto, and Sunnyvale? And these are school districts that are pretty much within driving distance, or normally when somebody's looking to move into our community, they're looking at all these areas. And what you can see in our district is everyone else is pretty much staying flat. And I think if you know, for the individuals that sent me a couple emails that were saying, well, it's about the demographics and our demographics are changing. Well, Sunnyvales are changing just as much as Mountain Views. But what Sunnyvale isn't experiencing is the same type of growth that we're experiencing. So again, I attribute that to the hard work that our staff has been doing across the board, not so much to demographic change, slight demographic changes over the time. And as you can see, everybody else is pretty much remaining close to where they are, but especially in ELA, we continue to be on an upward trend and are coming close to being in striking distance to Los Altos, which is what we always try to target, considering that part of Mountain View does connect with Los Altos District. Math, again, you see an upward trend. We were actually very close to Sunnyvale in 2015, and we have definitely pulled away from them. But this is our first year being flat in math, which has caused us a little concern, but we plan on addressing that particular issue. All right, and so we continue to perform higher than the state in ELA and math. We also are seeing our gains are for Latino, Hispanic students with disabilities are performing at a higher rate than the county. Right now, though, our English language learners are performing 2% below the county in math, and again, that reflects just across the board our focus that we need to focus on for math. And while we're improving, while we are improving, than our compared to our neighboring districts overall in ELA and math, we are starting to close the gap. And so an example of this is in 2015, there was a 28 percentage point between us and Los Altos and ELA. Now there's only a 16 percentage point difference between us. And then again, there was a 30% difference between us and Los Altos and math, and now we're only at 21%. So we're really starting to see some gains. But what's interesting about this is that where most of the gains came from in the elementary is actually in 5th grade. We saw some sizable jumps, and that's because of what occurred at a couple of sites, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But for ELA, we're seeing positive gains across the board, and I think that's a clear response to programs like SIOP. That is a clear response to instruction that is out all of our sites. We really have put a strong emphasis on literacy in our district across the board, including all the way down to making sure that kids are reclassified. So that's been a strong focus for us over the last couple of years. Unfortunately, though, in math, we are either somewhere close to where we were or we're seeing some drops. Specifically, we're seeing drops in 6th and 7th grade that lead us to a little bit concerned. We are providing professional development there to see what's taking place. We do believe that the math coach that focused on 5th grade last year had a sizable impact, and even though we don't have that math coach this year, we do want to focus on how we can continue that through a different model. And so we are focused on improving the outcomes there. And we still believe that the true intervention for math starts early on as opposed to later. But the one thing we have to note is that kids start off really strong in 3rd grade, and then for some reason or another, we start a downward trajectory as they get older. And so that suggests that there are some foundational issues that are taking place. And I'm going to talk about some of our solutions a little bit later. So this shows you the ELA scores by school. And I really want to highlight 3 schools specifically. Landos, Mistral, and Therakoff made sizable jumps in their performance of 9 to 10% respectively for ELA, which is really great efforts, sort of Herculean efforts across the board. We did see only one school site had a drop, or 2 school sites had drops from elementary in ELA, and that would be Montaloma and Stevenson. Montaloma's drop was obviously a little bit bigger in terms of the percentage points compared to Stevenson, which was close to where it was. But I think the work that occurred by those 3 principals was just something that was truly amazing at those sites. And so one of the focuses for our professional development with those principals is to make sure that we have repeat performances and that this wasn't a first one-time thing. Right. Math, we're seeing something a little bit different. So again, I think the fact that you have the former math coach for the district at Landos is reflective in the growth that you see at Landos Elementary. I also have to highlight Therakoff. Therakoff did an amazing job, almost a 10% jump in test scores, and they have really catapulted themselves into a different stratosphere of schools. We are providing professional development, or looking at professional development offerings for Castro and Montaloma, reflective of the drops that we're seeing at those sites. So we are a little bit concerned there. So overall, we saw a 3 percentage point gain from year to year, and we've seen an 11-point gain from 2014 to 2015. All grade levels improved in ELA last year, with grade 5 having the highest improvement of 6 percentage points. In math, we sort of see a little different story. We were flat this year, but we have gained 10 points since 2014 and 15. Again, 5th grade really set the tone, though, with increasing by 5 percentage points. So our 5th grade teachers really knocked it out the park. 6th, 7th grade decreased by 4 percentage points, and so we're focused for math and for them also. And so this sort of shows you what's taking place with our different subgroups. The things I want to highlight is that our RFEPs are actually performing on par with all kids. Obviously, we still have some work to do with getting them to perform on par with the English-only peers. But we are at least happy that on average they are performing at the same level, but we recognize there's a lot more work that has to be done. For English language learners, for ELA, and again, that's sort of a moving target a little bit, we are excited that we're seeing gains by 6 percentage points. Again, for economically disadvantaged, we see a 12% gain, and for students with disability, the 10% gain is a good thing. This is not to say that we are satisfied with where those scores are. Obviously, we would like to be in an environment where our students with disabilities are performing on par with their peers. I know our director for special education is working really hard to make it an inclusive environment at all of our sites, which will help increase the outcomes. But we need to stop and just pause for a second to just acknowledge the fact that we're doing some tremendous work with all of our subgroups here. And then I'm not going to go through each one of these slides, but obviously our English only at Castro had a sizable drop. So again, part of that is about figuring out what's taking place. Again, Montaloma unfortunately had a drop also, but so does Stevenson, and so we just need to figure out what's taking place for each one of those schools. So I'm going to keep on going to our math scores. Well, first let me just give up the summary for our ELA outcomes. All subgroups, with the exception of our white group, demonstrated gains in ELA from year to year. RFEP, ELs, SEDs, students with disabilities, Asians, all increased by 2 to 3%. Hispanic Latino, which is what we were highlighted for in the Learning Policy Institute report, increased by 5%. White students decreased by 1%, which means that they pretty much stayed the same. There has been an intentional focus on core ELA instruction and pacing at the middle school. We have been working very hard with the high school district to make sure that we're aligned and that we sort of understand. And then intentional focus on RFEP students. We had specific goals for monitoring our RFEP students in our site plans. And so we're excited for that. RTI has really been sort of a data-proven approach that we have, and has really focused a lot on improving ELA. And as we transition RTI to STEAM, we actually are allowing teachers to be at the forefront of addressing their kids' needs as opposed to having alternatives. And we believe that the focus on STEAM will also help drive math scores, because students will be exposed to more science in their classrooms. For math, again, by subgroup, this year we were a little flat, and we saw we have to do some work both at RFEP. Our English language learners had a sizable drop. So did our socioeconomics students, disadvantaged students. But what you also see is that our students with disabilities, who had gained 10 percentage points across the board, they've remained flat, which was good. So we didn't regress in every single area. But we clearly have some work to do in math to sort of fix those approaches. Again, I'm going to flip through this real quick and get to the summary highlights here. So we were fairly flat in math from year to year, with our socioeconomic disadvantaged students having the greatest deficit. I think part of our challenge was we had an elementary math coach, and that was focused at the 5th grade level, and that's the grade level that saw some significant gains. This also was the first year where we transitioned from 2 periods of math to 1, with an RTI period. I think there is some adjustment for teachers at the middle school in terms of how to teach within that time frame. I think being accustomed to having 90 minutes versus having 60 minutes does take some time. I can tell you as someone who taught both in a 90-minute and a 60-minute period, it really, you know, when you're teaching 90 minutes that alternates every other day, there is a totally different impact versus having 90 minutes every single day and 60 minutes. And so we should see some more adjustments. We've adjusted our pacing guide as a result, and we're providing more professional development to our middle school teachers. PSYOP strategies we're using consistently with math, and so we've talked about with our leadership team, and that will be reflected more in our site plans. And I know we talked about that also in terms of our overall strategy for meeting the board goal for having a year's worth of growth. We believe that PSYOP has to be integrated into all of our core subjects if we're really going to see some impactful gains, not just in ELA. And then goals for ELs, RFEPs, and RTI elementary, we're really focused on ELA as opposed to math. And by switching over to the STEAM model, you now have the ability to focus RTI on either one of those, depending on how the teachers sort of group their kids. So one of the things that we need to talk about is the trends that we're seeing at particular sites. Overall, Lando's had a 10 percentage point gain in ELA. The most significant gains was with SED students at 16%, which is really amazing, and English language learners, which is at 9%. However, their RFEP students did drop by 8%. And so that's one of the areas that we're working with the team at Lando's to say, you know, yes, you're getting kids reclassified. Yes, you're doing amazing work with English language learners, but you also have to remember that there are kids who have met the mark who need additional focus too. Therakoff, again, had an overall 10 percentage point gain in ELA. Again, English language learners, Latinos, students with disabilities all saw double-digit gains. All are hard groups to focus on, so Therakoff has been working really hard across the board. They had a slight decrease in performance for RFEPs, and what that tells me is that they really focus on all of their kids, and so it's not something that we want to harp on, but we just need to be aware of it. Mistral had a 9 percentage point gain in ELA, significant gains for English language learners, 21%, which is just really outstanding. Hispanic and Latino improved by 11%, socioeconomic disadvantaged students by 14%, and RFIP students increased by 15%. And I would say that the data practices that were brought in to Mistral last year and sort of the focus on improving outcomes for all of the kids is a large part to why you're seeing such sizable gains at Mistral, which is a really good thing for to take place. Crittenden had an overall 5 percentage point gain in ELA. Most significant was with their RFEP kids and Hispanic and Latino students. However, we did see struggles with our English language learners at the site. Bub had a 4 percentage gain in ELA, most significant with RFEP students with 10, Hispanic Latino students with 10, and students with disabilities with 15%. However, they did struggle with English language learners. I do want to point out that there was a change to the SDC program at Bub, and so that may impact what we see next year. Both Bub and Huff had some shuffling around as a result of the new programs coming online. Castro had a 1 percentage point gain in ELA, increase of 2 percentage points for RFEP students, but they really struggle with English language learners by negative, with a drop of 3%. At Graham, there was an overall 1 percentage point gain in ELA. It was an increase of 3 percentage points for Hispanic and Latino students. Socioeconomically disadvantaged students struggled, as well as students with disabilities. And so we need to put some more efforts in there with a drop of 4%. Montaloma for ELA had a 4 percentage point decrease in ELA. They did have gains for English language learners and Hispanic and Latinos and students with disabilities, but they had a sizable drop for the students that were reclassified by 19%. Huff had a 2 percentage point drop in ELA. They did experience gains for ELA for English language learners and RFEPs, but they did struggle with Hispanic Latinos, SED students, and students with disabilities. Students with disabilities dropped by 19% over at Huff. So part of that is about the inclusive practices that are taking place at Huff. And I know that our director of special ed is focused in on making sure that changes for the schools. Stevenson, 2 percentage point decrease. They did have significant gains for their students who are RFEP, as well as Hispanic, Latino, and SED students. English language learners were flat, though. And then in math, again, Therakoff led the way. Therakoff and Landos led the way in terms of their gains. Therakoff had a 9 percentage point gain in math. Most significant gains were students with disabilities of 16%. SED students were 8%, and Hispanic and Latinos were 5%. They did struggle with ELs for math. Landos experienced a 5 percentage gain. ELs and students with disabilities, 4 to 5%, but they also struggle with RFEP and SED. Bob, 3 percentage gain in math, and part of the reason why I'm reading this out loud is because this presentation was not presented, or was not it was added at the very last minute, and so the public doesn't have access to it until we post it. So I guess I should have pointed that out, that this is the only reason why I'm reading these actual scores here. But they had their most significant gains at Bub were with the RFEP students and with Hispanics and Latinos of 10 to 8% respectively. They did, however, struggle with the EL students at 13. Crittenden had a 1 percentage gain, but for the most part, they were flat with all their groups. Huff had no gain or loss in terms of overall, but the most significant gains were with their RFEP students, but the most significant decline was with their students with disabilities, which was 23%. Castro had a 6% decrease in math across the board, which is why we're going to add professional development and support over there. Montaloma, the same thing, 4 percentage point decrease in math with minor declines for English-only students and more significant declines for ELs, RFEPs, students with disabilities and socioeconomic disadvantage. Graham also saw a sizable decrease of 4%. Students with disabilities at Graham really struggled, so we need to focus our attention there. Stevenson had a 2 percentage drop, and while there were increases in their subgroups, the increases were small, and for the most part, the larger subgroups didn't improve. Mistral had a 1 percentage point decrease in math. They did increase 10 percentage points for RFEP, but they had a drop for English language learners, Hispanic, Latinos, and students socioeconomic disadvantage. I do want to point out that this year Mistral is moving to Eureka Math from Go Math, and so they will be aligned with all of our students. And so hopefully you will see that also reflected in what occurs at the middle schools, because I think one of the big things we've learned as we discovered, and I know Tracy Gutierrez Jr. can attest to this, there is a difference between having your kid go through Go Math and then having to adjust to Eureka Math in the 6th grade when everyone else has had a head start to adjust. And so that's a big adjustment period that we're seeing. So we're glad that Mistral is using a uniform curriculum as everybody else. So I do want to point out, so what does this look like if we include Vargas into it? And so, you know, where is it? Sorry. All right, so if we look at the results with the new boundaries, what you will see is that Vargas is currently performing at 79% for ELA. These are the kids that tested in, so this is 3rd and 4th grade. And Therakoff moves up to 64%. And then you can sort of see where everybody else is. Castro, which also sees a sizable increase in students, only moves to 44%. But this gives you an idea of what it would look like as if Vargas was there this year. For math, again, you'll see Vargas is, as the newest school, is at 74%, and it's doing pretty well. Therakoff, again, is at 54%. Castro drops down to 31%. So what we're seeing now is that with a redistribution of students, you are seeing some equal, you see schools sort of equalizing around certain points. But again, this just highlights that Castro and Montaloma really need some additional assistance when it comes to math to address those particular things. And so when we look at these results, we're going to make some changes across the board. And so I want to jump into the actions that we're going to do. The first one is that we're going to continue to look at data. Data really drives a lot of our processes in our district, but we have added new goals and actions for site plans in order to address. And those site plans are available for the public to view as well as trustees over the course of the next month, and they won't be approved until November. So we do need to address the needs of our high performers. I think one of the groups that we have forgotten about, not intentionally, RTI has addressed their needs, but we need to be very specific in our site plans, is focusing in on our high performers, that they have increased rigor in the classroom. We also want to increase the communication with parents and students about academic performance, which is also why we moved to iReady. And so those reports actually there's a lot more information than what the parents got. And so I encourage parents to meet with teachers to talk about what those results are, so you can find out specifics about how your kid is performing. But we felt like it was really important for parents and for kids and parents to know exactly how kids are performing in sort of a real-time basis versus having a veiled curtain in terms of our academic performance of our benchmarks. And then we also want to make sure that we're monitoring English language learners who score 4 on the LPAC and supporting them to reclassify. We've already started looking at the list. Our first group of kids who are reclassified are currently going through, and then Director Smith will make sure that all sites are informed of which kids did not reclassify, so they can target those students to make sure that they do. We also are looking at new pacing guides both for ELA at the middle school and revised pacing guides for math. And then the elementary ELA also includes some new material. And then the elementary math is now including some parent support documents. And then our new science ELA scope and sequence is taking place. Again, we changed over, I mentioned this earlier, we changed our assessments to iReady, and we're going to continue to use Literally to monitor our kids' performance in terms of reading. We are going to do some more intentional focus for professional development. SciOp, math, I've mentioned this a couple times. Montaloma and Castro are going to get additional help from the district to help with math. And we feel like differentiation is an issue across all of our sites. And so we want to make sure that we're addressing those, which is also part of why we changed the elementary format for response to instruction and why science is being integrated, which allows for more extension. And then again, we're going to continue to provide additional support for RTI at the middle schools. The other thing I want to talk about just real quick is that one last decision that we made just recently is more of an issue around equity. What we noticed is that certain sites have made choices instructionally to make an additional purchase for iReady tutorials after hours. And so some sites essentially chose to do iReady for just one subject area because that's all they could afford. And then other sites chose to do iReady for both. And what we realized is that this is really an equity issue about haves and have-nots. And I want to be clear about who our haves and who our have-nots are. Our haves are sites that have additional funds that can afford these programs. Schools like Castro, Therakoff that have Title I funds, Huff, Bub, Stevenson, whose foundation, and Mistral, whose foundations can raise a sizable amount of money, have the option to really purchase these programs. However, schools like Landos, Montaloma, and Vargas, whose PTAs are not raising, especially in Vargas, who has a brand new PTA, do not have the additional site funds in order to purchase these particular materials. And the reason why this came up is because we found out that Huff actually assigns homework to their kids to do iReady after hours. And iReady allows you to continue moving forward regardless of if you're performing on 3rd grade. You can keep doing iReady and all the way up until you get tired, which could take you as far as 5th, 6th, 7th grade. But not every kid has that opportunity. And part of this is that we made some strategic decisions last year to make some reductions. And so as a result of that, I informed staff after talking with principals and talking with cabinet that we are going to use one-time funds to purchase iReady for every single student. And the reason why is that for the cost of one teacher, we can provide an after-school tutor to every single kid that chooses to use it. Now, the point here is that not everyone's going to choose to go online to have their kids. There are fluent kids that aren't going to do it, and there are poor kids that are not going to do it. But what we can do is provide every single kid access to someone who can provide them with an intervention at their own level and that can fill gaps. And if a kid wants to go to the library, elementary student wants to go to the library to jump onto iReady to get additional help, that is available to them. Or if they have an older sibling who is given a tablet device at home, they can utilize that device to log on to the computer. So we are purchasing this for every single kid because we believe this is an issue of equity and that every kid should have access at any time of the day to high quality instruction. And while I'm not arguing that iReady is the solution, I do think that it counteracts some of the things like Kumon and Russian math that some of our parents have access to and other ones don't. And so none of us felt comfortable with this equity issue that existed. And so this is an additional strategy that we're employing, and we will evaluate this at the end of the year to see if there's any type of impact, and we will monitor the usage data. But it is unfair for a school like Vargas to make a decision to take $20,000 out of their budget to purchase iReady only for ELA, and they can't purchase it for math. But another school's PTA can write a check to purchase it. And so that just shouldn't happen in this world, and so we're not going to let it happen.
Are these annual licenses or in perpetuity?
So it's an annual license.
So we would have to do this every year.
Mhm.
Okay.
And so that concludes the presentation. If there are any questions, feel free to ask.
I have a question.
Sure.
So why don't we pay for the licenses?
We are paying for the license.
But before, if the PTAs pay for them,
So-
why are they paying? For
So part of this was when not every site believes in the value of iReady. There are some sites that have already had existing licenses and they were comfortable with the programs that they were doing. And there were some teachers that just aren't comfortable with using that. And so we were very sensitive to past approaches where we brought in something and it wasn't utilized. And we actually monitor all of our data, all of our programs to look at the usage rates to see whether a program is viable or not. And so in examining that, we felt like the decision to use iReady is really a site decision because we didn't provide any training. We simply went with the assessment part because we like the assessments. And so because we were given the freedom, sites the freedom to make the choice, this actually was a predictable outcome, that certain sites would choose to use iReady and other sites would not. And so after reflecting on that decision, we felt like it was important just to correct it and say everybody gets it.
So going forward for the budget for coming years, would we anticipate that the district will be purchasing licenses for both math and ELA for all the schools, or
If one-time funds exist, so this year our textbook adoption at the middle school came in about 200,000 less than what we anticipated, and so that allowed us to use the surplus there. So we will always use one-time funds for this. We won't use ongoing funds. And I think it's important that we continue to monitor it so that we're seeing the value of it as opposed to just buying it. And there were some programs when I first arrived that had been here, like we had ST Math for middle schoolers, but no middle schooler was using ST Math. And so that's one of those things we just want to be mindful that it doesn't become a legacy program.
Well, and just to understand what the budget implications are, if the district were to purchase it for math and ELA for all the schools,
It's about $160,000 or the cost of one teacher.
so it's $160,000 for an annual license for everybody. Okay.
Do they have enterprise solutions, or can you just site by site? Because oftentimes enterprise solutions are cheaper.
So it's based
That
off
is-
of the number of users that you have.
Is it?
so-
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay. I have a
Thank you.
question. I know you made a quick reference to increasing rigor, and are we already using RTI to do that? I know we do that to bring kids up to a certain place and when kids are already at a certain place, but is there a structure within RTI that can add rigor?
Yes, so as part of our response to instruction program this year and utilizing STEAM, That's where we're driving a lot of the rigor
Okay.
in the conversations.
Okay.
And we have two programs that we use. And the first one is with Sciences Elementary. It's providing training for all of our teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have Discovery Education, which is helping to design very creative and forward-thinking projects for students to use. And then the classroom teacher is able to regroup their students and adjust to what the kid has, as opposed to asking the RTI teacher to adjust to, you know, all of the kids. And so we think this is a better approach to allow rigor for all kids.
Okay. My overarching, I guess it's not really a question, but these scores are incredible at a lot of sites. I want to acknowledge some of the amazing work that's happened. My question is about both Castro and Montaloma. I'm a little disheartened to see some of the results here and consistent across groups and across subject content. I don't really know that that's a question as opposed to sort of pointing out the obvious. I don't know, I mean, we can provide additional supports. What are we missing?
So part of what we're doing is deconstructing what's taking place at both of those sites, and then really focusing in on what may be missing. So I don't want to speculate on what we need to do, but we did reach out. I've reached out personally to both of the principals after we looked at the scores, and we're like, you know, we're going to do something. And so we've been talking with a couple of vendors, both from the county and outside of the county, to see who could provide us with professional development. And so we're gonna start there, and then we'll come back with a larger plan.
Okay.
I assume that'll be reflected in the school site plans for those sites?
Yes.
Yeah, and I feel so bad that our meeting only has a few minutes left, because I feel like this is the meat of the work, and it's also, much of this is a celebration of all of the hard work that you and all of the district staff and all of our teachers have done. I want to make sure to point out that for English language learners in ELA, 3 new principals had huge growth. Mistral, Landals, and Thierkoff all had brand new principals at their sites. And so to see this amount of growth from somebody who just arrived at a school site, like on top of everything else for English learners, is really incredible.
Kudos. And on a more administrative angle, will this be posted? Will the package be updated? Because I can't, the writing's too small on this. And
I know.
okay, thank you.
Yes, we will post it,
Great.
and then we'll send it out as part of a larger communique, just also highlighting everything in the presentation with links for them to look at it, as well as the earlier study that was referenced. I know we've talked about before, but it's nice to bring that back to the forefront and wrap it all in.
Thank you.
Other questions from the trustees?
Well, I have a comment, and you know,
Okay.
I'm going to pile on here, asking Dr. Rudolph, did you personally go to these 3 schools that got this, you know, wonderful growth, and to congratulate the principal and the staff?
So I mean, we've alluded to it a couple of times, but we held back from really sharing the results because we were waiting for it to be publicly announced. And so over the next week and a half or so, we'll go to those sites and celebrate. I know the principals have talked about it, and at the end of the year, we sort of mentioned it, but we sort of held, we wanted to wait until the board and the public saw it before we did anything else.
Well, I'd ask for questions from the public, but there's nobody left here. So are there any final comments from board members? Okay, we have future, or board updates.
I have a quick update. So I just want to share with the board, I know we're looking at mental health and wellness issues, and I just wanted to remind the public that on October 23rd at between 6:30 to 8 p.m. at Graham MUR, there's going to be a mental health basics session class where people will be able to find out how to deal with mental health, and including definitions, coping with stress, when it's important to seek help, combating stigma, and how to get help within Santa Clara County. And that's also available in Spanish.
Thank you, Trustee Gutierrez.
I have a future agenda item.
Okay.
I know we had a presentation, well, a public comment earlier about our dress code, and students and parents who came to support that comment about the dress code and reevaluating it as part of our health and wellness approach. My understanding is that also last year at Crittenden, a group of female students organized and actually did a presentation around the dress code issue to the principal, but it was something that is a district policy. It's not a school site policy. And it looks like what we have right now is what CSBA has. So I'd like to propose this as a future agenda item.
But when I read the district policy, it said that the schools were the ones, the sites were the ones that would adopt codes.
And review
when-
them annually. That's what the code says.
Don't
That
they
the
have
site
to
level
ad-
decisions are bound between the boundaries within the existing policy at the board level, but
It
they
has
get
to
the
be with-
site level decisions.
Right,
And they
so-
review them at the site level?
So we do set the precedent by having a policy that the schools have to build off of. And so there are,
And we trust our site administrators to administer it.
we do trust our site administrators to administer it, but we have to give good guidance around that. So if things like a female's body being distracting are an issue, I think it's worth learning from the community about it. The students who are experiencing it, the families who are really engaged around it, the professionals like clinical psychologists in our community who know a lot about this issue. So I'd like to see it added to a future agenda or rolled into the health and wellness.
I'd like to see it rolled into the health and wellness discussion or series of discussions that we're going to have. I definitely would like to hear more about this and discuss it.
I'm not uninterested, but I just feel like it's more of a site level thing, and I'd like to see the sites take the lead initially. That would be my preference. I know this was very big when my 23-year-old was at Graham. I think that's when, so it's been, 10 or 12 years, and I'd like to see what the sites do with it. That would be my preference.
I agree with Trustee Blakely, but I also would prefer, if this does get addressed, that it's done in the Health and Wellness Committee and not to take district staff time on it at this point, and see what the community, and if the people who are here in this room tonight want to become part of that committee, that would be great.
And it sounds like there's some good models out there with other school districts, so it might not be that big of a deal, but
Yeah.
I'd love to see
Yeah.
the sites address it first. And that's what our board policy says.
Yeah, I don't want to take away their discretion. Okay, do we have lists of future board meeting dates? And it
Yeah, and
looks like-
remember that, I don't know how you're going to do this, but delete that calendar item.
Yes, we need to
October
take
17th.
the October 17th special study session off the
Yeah,
calendar.
it
So
can
the
off
one
this
that's,
calendar.
it's on the public list, the email I don't think was sent to the public is what Trustee Wheeler's alluding to. So we could like
The
that
agenda
removed,
was
please,
created at,
before the decision was
before the
made.
decision was made, so.
Okay, at 10:29 PM, we will adjourn this meeting of the Mountain View Wisdom School District Board of Trustees.